Well, honourable members, I note that before we commence, there is a request for an intervention by the Honourable Sankok. You have a,
yes.
Before we even... So, you see, I noticed that your card was put for intervention.
Order number 1, administration of oath. Order number 2, communication from the chair. Order number 3, messages. Order number 4, petitions. Order number 5, papers.
The Vice Chair, Departmental Committee on Health, Honorable Mishra, Dr. Mishra.
Thank you, Speaker, sir. Honorable Speaker, I beg to lay the following papers on the table of the House today, Wednesday, October 9th, 2019. Reports of the Departmental Committee on Health on number 1, Public Petition number 59 of 2019 regarding mental health issues and the need for the more counselors in public facilities, and number 2, Public Petition number 60 of 2019 regarding the management of hemophilia and other bleeding disorders among patients in Kenya. Thank you.
Energy. Honorable Gikaria, or the Vice Chair.
Honorable Speaker, just give me a minute. I organize myself. I've just arrived. A minute, and then I'll be maybe. I've just received. Just a minute. I'll be back.
But I've approved the report. It is to table the report.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I beg to lay the following papers on the table of the House today, Wednesday, October 9th, 2019. Reports on the Departmental Committee on Energy on its consideration on 1, public petition regarding water supply constraints caused by the Kenya Power tariffs in Kilifi County. 2, public petition regarding demolition of houses in Chokaa, Mihango area, Embakasi East constituency by Kenya Power Lighting Limited Company. 3, public petition regarding way leave compensation to landowners in Maraigushu by the Kenya Electricity Transmission Company, KETRACO, for the 63rd General Conference of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Australia, from these are the report on the 16th to 20th, 2019. And lastly, the conference of the Africa Oil, Gas and Energy in Fraser, Suits, Perth, Australia, from 2nd to 7th September 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Next order. Next order. Is there another paper?
Order number 6, notices of motion.
The Honorable Anita Gatti.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I beg to give notice of the following motion. That aware that according to the World Health Organization, an estimated 15% of the world's population live with some form of disability or different ability, with 80% of them living in developing countries. Further aware that in Kenya, approximately 6.5 million people live with some form of disability, out of whom 3.8 million are women and girls, while approximately 85% of the total number live in abject poverty. Concerned that a majority of
Public Service Commission's policy on requirements needed by applicants to secure entry-level jobs in the public service. Number 2, could the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether work-based experience is a requirement for youth to secure entry-level jobs? Thank you very much.
Referred to the Committee on Administration and National Security for response. Next question by the member for Mathare, the Honorable Anthony Oluoch. Next question by, I have information the Honorable, Honorable Oluoch, you have made it. You had sent a message to the Secretariat to say that you are held up in the jam.
I was in traffic and I made it. I'm trying to look for the question. If I could get a hard copy.
In the meantime, then the question. In the meantime, Honorable Oluoch, we can have the member for Madhioya asking his question. Honorable Peter Kimari Kihara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask question 449. And Mr. Speaker, it's my prayer that the question will be redirected to devolution and planning, because this particular borehole was sunk by Tarda. Could the Cabinet Secretary explain why the Nyangete borehole in Getuge ward of Madhya constituency, which was sunk using public funds in 2017, is yet to be equipped? When will the said borehole be equipped to ensure provision of safe and sufficient water to thousands of residents of Mathioya is accomplished? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretariat to note the question is referred to the Departmental Committee of Finance and Planning and not to Environment and Natural Resources, because the questioner desires it goes to that particular ministry to be responded by the Ministry of Planning and Devolution. Yeah. So, Secretariat to note that. Now we go to the Honorable Anthony Oluoch.
Use this one here.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Speaker. I rise to ask question number 448 of 2019 to the Cabinet Secretary for Lands. Could the Cabinet Secretary provide the ownership status of the parcel of land LR number 209/8600 located in Hospital Ward, Mathare constituency, currently inhabited by over 30,000 residents, but whose ownership is disputed between the Kenya Police Depot situated in Mathare area residents? Number 2, what urgent step is the Cabinet Secretary taking to resolve this dispute? I thank you, Honorable Speaker.
The question is referred to the Departmental Committee on Lands. Honourable members, before we go to the next segment of that order, allow me to recognize the presence of the following pupils and students from these institutions listed. Pupils from Moi Air Base Primary School, Kamukunji constituency, Nairobi County. AIC Matiani Girls Secondary School, Kilome constituency, Makueni County. And Diamumo Secondary School, Mwengi Central, Kitui County. You are welcome to observe the proceedings of the National Assembly this afternoon. The next segment is a segment on statements. And the first on the list is the Honorable Anthony Oluoch again.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 442C, I wish to request for a statement from the Chairperson of the Departmental Committee on Education regarding the imminent closure of informal schools across the country. Honorable Speaker, the Basic Education Regulations 2015 was gazetted by the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Science and Technology on the 4th of April 2015 for the mapping, recognition, registration, and provisions of other benefits to alternative basic education and training schools, otherwise known as APBET. Honorable Speaker, the basic education regulations have not been comprehensively incorporated into the Basic Education Act 2013 to fully embrace and mainstream APBET schools into the formal education structure or systems, and further, the legal framework governing the APBET schools is unclear, and cumulative effect of this ambiguity violates the rights to a quality, free basic education for every child. Honorable Speaker, APBET is largely conducted by schools found largely in informal settlements and slum areas, and are categorized or described as schools that are neither public nor private. Further, Honorable Speaker, APBET schools comprise 70% of schools in informal settlements and lack infrastructure and basic amenities and have no budgeted provisions under the Ministry of Education. Honorable Speaker, the informal schools across the country is currently facing imminent closure. A government reactionary decision made as a result of the death of 8 pupils at Precious Talent top schools in Nairobi, Dagoretti South. Honorable Speaker, it is against this background that I seek a statement from the chairperson of the Departmental Committee on Education on the following. 1, what alternative arrangements has the government made to accommodate all learners who...
To education, and already tenders have been issued, Honorable Speaker.
What? The point of order is about what? I didn't get you.
Honorable Speaker, the House does not legislate in vain. The House
has done what?
Does not make law in vain.
Yeah.
Honorable Speaker, we have gone through a rigorous budget-making process, and in the Committee of Labor and Social Welfare, we had put 450 million for procurement of sanitary towels in Public Service, Youth, and Gender Ministry. That money have been moved without the approval of this House to the Ministry of Education, and tenders have already been advertised.
What do you want me to do?
Tenders have already been advertised through IFMIS. So
how is it connected? Because you rose on a point of order. What is the issue? No, it has no connection with what you say.
Is it in order for them to...
If you want to seek a statement,
yes,
please, just do like the Honorable Pukose has done. You don't want to ride on his request for a statement, because now you are diluting his. You are mixing his.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Yes, please, Honorable Sankok, now we cannot now start heaping another one. I have not seen yours to approve it. So this one, yours is we just consider it or term it as something you felt excited about and you wanted to draw the attention of the House. But if you want it to be acted on, please just go and draft a proper request for a statement about that particular aspect. It is important. It requires, what is this? It requires a response, but not in the manner that you are bringing it up, because now it will not be responded to. You know, honourable members, I'm not too sure that I know of any member who can be described in the term that the Honourable Sankoka said, but he's the one describing himself as a mono. I don't know whether mono-legged, or monologue. Now, which of these leader majority?
Speaker, Honorable Sonkoka has raised a serious matter, but that's a matter that the chair of Labour, and where he is a member, they can call both the CS for public service and the CS for education and deal with it. So he's a member of the Labour Committee. So you can call the CS, Professor Kobia, and call Professor Magoha, and deal with them that why are they violating what the House has passed. Not a statement, and he's a member of that committee. So now that he has confirmed that he is in the process of learning, I really want to tell him that that's part of learning. You want to teach him? Talk to your chair call the two ministers and ask why that reallocation was done outside what the House has passed.
Very well.
Yes, you have learned.
Member for Kisauni, Honorable Bogo Menza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of order regarding a question I raised maybe 3-4 months ago before the House went for recess regarding the non-payment of suppliers of the various prisons within my constituency, within Kisauni constituency. The matter was referred to CS Interior and National Coordination, but to date, we've not received any response in regard to that matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Departmental Committee. Oh, sorry. The request by the Honorable Pukose is directed to the Departmental Committee on Finance and Planning. I can see the chairperson is here, the Honorable Limo, to delve into the allegations made in the request by the Honorable Pukose. I can see the chair, the deputy chair of the Committee on Administration is present, the Honorable Aluke.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. The matter the MP has asked is weighty and is of national concern, Honorable Speaker. Due to a lot of work that we have been having, like what you witnessed yesterday, Mr. Speaker, that's why we've not answered this question. So I'm asking the member to give us 3 weeks. Honorable Speaker will give an answer. Thank you.
I've been informed that your committee has scheduled to have the Cabinet Secretary appear on some identified dates to come and respond to all the questions. Are you aware, Honorable Aluke, of that arrangement?
Honorable Speaker, questions are too many. Even if we appear on Friday, I think he's not going to answer all questions that are. Like today only, Mr. Speaker, in the morning, we've got about 8 questions. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not a machine. It's just maybe he'll answer the few, and then, if possible, if he's able to answer all of them, Mr. Speaker, then he will answer. And his question will be one of those that the minister will answer, Honorable Speaker.
Very well, because it's a question he raised quite some time back. Make sure that it is also included among those ones that the CS is going to respond to. Honorable Wario, what's your intervention?
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, if you remember, during the budgetary processes, there was an effort to move that money from State Department of Gender to Education. It was through your intervention that that money was again relocated to gender. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm baffled. We are supposed to oversight the State Department of Gender. When you appear before us during budgetary processes, you give us your strategic plan. We allocate funds to a specific department. Then the executive will sit and move that fund to another department. As a parliamentary committee, we have raised with the CS concern before our committee, Mr. Speaker. Now the challenge facing us as a committee of labor, as raised by Mheshimiwa Songok, how are we going to oversight? The indication, Mr. Speaker, is that this money is not going to the right direction. There is restricted tender, which we don't know the reason. The department dealing with it is a different one. When they appeared before us for funding, is a different department. I'm appealing for your intervention and indulgence, Mr. Speaker, because we are lost. How do we oversight this money, Mr. Speaker?
Honorable Wario and other chairs of committees, if you discover a matter similar to the one you've raised, that is misapplication of the resources, please, you have the right to call the particular cabinet secretary and the accounting officer, give them directions. If they do not follow those directions, bring a report here for sanction. That's the reason why the House exists here.
Yeah, because, Mr. Speaker, our budget now is based on programs. So if the government executive wants to shift a program from one ministry or department to another, I don't see why there is a problem there, so long as the money remains under that program. But in the event that money will be reallocated from a program, then that becomes an audit query, and this House can deal with it appropriately in not only the departmental committee, but even the Public Accounts Committee. So, Mr. Speaker, unless now the committee that is complaining comes out clearly to explain to the House exactly what crime the executive has committed, we may be discussing something that maybe there is nothing really wrong that the executive has committed. Because the executive has the leeway, the space, the legal framework. They can shift, change programs from one ministry to another one, from one state department to another. Yes, they can. No, you know, Mr. Speaker, I think Honorable Duale was consulting with you, and he has just come back. He has not even listened to what I'm saying, and he's already leading a troop saying no. But what I know is that we are doing program-based budget at the moment. So, why would you be concerned about the government taking a program to another department to execute it, to implement it? Let it be implemented where the executive feels it should be implemented, and if there is a crime committed, the Auditor General will pick it up and bring it to the House. So I think unless there is something that the committee is not clear about, and I can see the Committee of Labor is the one that is so concerned, including Honorable Sankok, who has come to confront me here, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't know why Honorable Sankok has come to attack me. I'm actually making a contribution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
No, members, I think let us appreciate that, yes, you know, so, and also, just to encourage chairs, just to encourage the chairpersons, the statement that is issued, understanding, and you just go, as chairperson, just go and look at standing order number 44. Every Thursday, or at least before the end of the sitting week, the leader of the majority party, on behalf of the House Business Committee, always gives these statements. I think it's not really, it's not asking you for too much to require you to check whether there is anything that in the statement of the leader of the majority party on behalf of the House Business Committee as said is going to appear before your committee. Because, you know, you are the chair, you are in leadership. You are the chair, you should take time to go also check whether there is anything coming before your committee. But this thing of you always saying you want to send your clerks, you know, remember, in fact, as the chair, you are even required to look through reports, draft reports as they are being made, even before the other members of the committees. I don't know whether you have not seen that. It is there in the standing orders. So don't give that work to the people clerking your committees. It is you as the chairperson who is required to even look at the draft and see whether it really reflects what has transpired before your committee, before it is even presented before the plenary of your committees. Honorable Rachel Nyamai, you wanted to, you have also been mentioned.
Yes.
No? Maybe adversely.
Yeah. Well, Honorable Speaker, I think it is important that I respond because the Cabinet Secretary for Lands has been trying as much as possible to respond to questions. With regard to the 3 questions that have been, 4 actually, that have been raised, they seem to be recent, maybe about 2 weeks. But there is a matter that was raised by the Honorable Amisi, and I believe that that question has been answered unless he brought a further question. So I would like to say that the Cabinet Secretary for Lands wrote to the Parliamentary Committee on Lands requesting for 1 more week for her to be able to respond to the 3 questions. But about the first question, Honorable Speaker, raised by the Honorable Amisi, I have a strong belief that this question has been already responded to. Unfortunately, the questions have not been stated. Only the member who has asked the question and the number of the question. So I'm not able to tell whether it is the one about compensation for people living along a certain highway that is being constructed. If that is a question, it's already responded to, but I would like to take seriously the guidance that you have given us, and I will follow up to ensure that by Thursday, as it has been agreed, the questions are responded to. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Well, Honorable Kosing.
I thank you, Honorable Speaker. And I want to tell the House that all the questions, Honorable Speaker, that have come to my committee have been addressed properly, or rather answered. The minister came last week on Thursday, and all the questions that were on our order paper were really and properly answered, Honorable Speaker. So the ones I have seen raised by the Leader of Majority look to be strange. So what I will do, Honorable Speaker, following your directive, I will go to his office and reconcile the documentation from the clerk office and the Leader of Majority. But I want to tell the House, Honorable Speaker, the Ministry of Transport answers the questions as they come. We don't keep them. And this committee, Honorable Speaker, has good record in this House. So I want to follow your directive, but we'll reconcile. But it looks strange, but I will reconcile them, Honorable Speaker. I thank you.
Very well. I think let's now do business. Let's go to business. Honorable Kadie, this is Honorable Kadie. Kamren, sorry. Now, Honorable Angwenyi, now you know his name as Kibiegon or Kamren.
Thank you.
Honorable Kamren.
Thank you, Speaker. My concern is what we are getting from the Chairman of Interior. I asked a question on October last year when 5 students were killed. And up to now, I have not gotten a question, an answer. I'm wondering when he's telling us about the clerk, about the procedures, while Kenyans are waiting for those answers. You know, we are not asking questions from ourselves. We are asking questions from our people. So I'm wondering, I'm wondering.
Absolutely, I agree with
it's
you.
Like there's a failure somewhere.
In fact, Honorable Kamren says he asked a question in October last year, and we're in October 2019. Maybe, Honorable Kamren, why don't you just walk there, sit next to him. You can displace the member for Kangema for a while so that he can give you an answer. Please, I think that is too serious. If the question was asked in October last year, Honorable Koinange, maybe have a word with Honorable Kamren. Maybe you might have lost his question. And I agree with him. He was not asking the question for the sake of it. It was on behalf of the people. I think he deserves an answer. October last year. So, Honorable Kamren, before the chairman walks out, you take advantage of his presence and approach him, but quietly. And maybe you can report later whether you have been given a satisfactory answer. Honorable Gladwell, Jesire, you also you have another one of last year?
No, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mine is so recent. It's not overdue. The question on the school, the Cabernet School for the Deaf and Blind that I asked recently, it was an urgent issue, Mr. Speaker, sir, because the school hasn't opened up to today for this term. And I wanted actually the answer to be fast-tracked so that those vulnerable children can get justice, Mr. Speaker, sir.
That's the question? Because was it by private notice?
It was normal, Mr. Speaker, sir, but I requested it to be handled urgently.
You know, the only way, that request might not have been known. Because if it was not a question by private notice, then it may be going through the normal process of maybe being forwarded to the ministry to be responded to in the usual way.
Please
maybe after
advise,
2
Mr.
weeks.
Speaker, sir.
It's the desire of the House that I put the question. Very well. Just, you can sit next to these two gentlemen. Honorable Kabinga, you can sit between the member for Kangema and the member for Kiamba. Honourable members, having confirmed that the House quorates, I therefore put the question, which is that the Circle Societies Amendment Bill, National Assembly Bill, member for Baringo and member, please, consult in low tones. I'm not saying you shouldn't consult, but you must also allow us to transact this business. So, honourable members, I put the question, which is that the Circle Societies Amendment Bill, National Assembly Bill number 1 of 2018 be now read a third time. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. As many as of the contrary opinion say nay? The ayes have it.
A bill for an act of parliament to amend the Circle Societies Act of 2008.
Next order.
Order number 9, motion, report of the Committee of the Whole House on the Sectional Properties Bill, National Assembly Bill number 23 of 2019. Question to be put and third reading.
Honourable members, again, debate on this motion was concluded yesterday when the House was in Committee of the Whole House. What remained is for the question to be put for agreement with the report of the Committee of the Whole House. And I hereby do.
Honourable Speaker, I beg to move that the Sectional Properties Bill, National Assembly Bill number 23 of 2019 be now read a third time. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there are many people wondering what is sectional property. Those of you who will own or own apartments and office blocks in an apartment building, if this law is passed, you can have your own title deed, and you can have ownership. Now you have no legal document, because those of us who were here yesterday and who followed this bill, like Honorable Nyikal and many, and Honorable Bandi, we know it. So I beg to move and ask the chair of lands, Honorable Nyamae, who did a lot of work on this bill, to second.
Honorable Nyamae.
Honorable Speaker, I would like to say that this bill is extremely important, and it is going to ensure that fraudsters do not continue cheating Kenyans who may not be able to understand land buying and property buying. So I would like to thank the House for the debate that we did, and I second. Thank you.
There can't be a point. No, honourable members, I am aware, I can now see that not many of us have been reading what passes through the House. The first Sectional Properties Act was passed by Parliament in 1989. This law seeks to now improve. Since 89 and today, surely, a lot has happened. In fact, those of us who know, who can tell you the history, will tell you the first building in Kenya to apply this law is a small building with red bricks below NHIF, or below the Ministry of Health. That was the first building, for those who have been following some of these laws. But, honourable members, I propose a question, which is that the Sectional Properties Bill, National Assembly Bill number 23 of 2019, be now read a third time. I thought I had seen some members who wanted to. The member for Suna East wants to say something. It's at liberty. Well, it's the mood of the House that I put the question. Very well. I think the Honorable Junet wanted to know what is this section. Honourable members, having confirmed as required by the Constitution that the House curates, will as many as of the contrary opinion say nay? The ayes have it.
A bill for an act of parliament to provide for the division of buildings into units to be owned by individual proprietors and common property to be owned by proprietors of units as tenants in common, and to provide for the use and management of the units and common property and for connected purposes.
Next order. Sorry, yeah, let it be read out so that you can then raise your point of order. I wanted to get a record of how many members have contributed.
Order number 10, motion, report on a fact-finding mission on the welfare of migrant Kenyan workers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Resumption of debate.
Honourable Bukose, what is your point of order?
Honourable Speaker, this motion had been debated yesterday, and I'm understanding Order 95, that the mover be called to reply, considering that issues that are pertaining to this motion and the mood of the House, I think we can be able to dispense with this matter, Honourable Speaker.
Well, is that the... Honourable members, let me put the question, which is that, as requested by the Honourable Bukose, that the mover be called upon to reply. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. As many of the contrary opinion say nay? The ayes have it. Mover.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, allow me to take this opportunity to register my appreciation to members who have contributed to this particular motion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I could have just tabled this report like any other report, but my intention was to share the same with members so that they enrich and we work this work together. As a committee, Mr. Speaker, despite the challenges faced by Kenyan migrant workers in Saudi and Middle East, Mr. Speaker, there is an opportunity, and that opportunity will address the problem of unemployment in the country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before 2018, there was no legal instrument, Mr. Speaker, sir. At least today there is a bilateral agreement, and the suffering will be monitored by both Kenya and Saudi Arabia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other issue I wanted to share with members, before 2017, there was no labor attaché anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker, representing Kenya. We have taken the first step. There is a labor attaché, despite the challenges, Mr. Speaker. One example I wanted to share with the House, Mr. Speaker. Moving from Riyadh, which is the capital headquarters, to Jeddah is 1,000 kilometers, Mr. Speaker. Our labor attaché have no staff. This is a one-man without proper resources. That is why, as a committee, Mr. Speaker, we have requested the ministry concerned to fund the labor attachés in this country so that they look for more market. In terms of content, Mr. Speaker, yes, I agree. We need to improve the report. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will table two documents. One is the minute for adoption of this report. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we have a list of accredited agents for employment of migrant workers. Mr. Speaker, this will help us. This will help us largely in sensitizing in our constituents, Mr. Speaker, so that whenever anybody is going outside this country, Mr. Speaker, they should go through a registered agent. Most of the problem faced by Kenyan migrant workers, Mr. Speaker, is through unregistered agents. That is why, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to table that list. It's a list of 211 companies We have put the name of the directors, their physical address, their phone numbers. That will help sensitize our constituents, Mr. Speaker. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I just want to respond to two concerns. A member mentioned we are careless and casual. If I will follow that allegation, Mr. Speaker, a careless and a casual chair will not table such a report, Mr. Speaker, and it's unfortunate to come from a honorable member. With that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move. I beg to reply.
Honourable members, the chair of ICT, no, just remain where you are. You don't have to kneel. Honourable members, I put the question, which is that this House adopts the report of the Departmental Committee on Labour and Social Welfare on the visit to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on a fact-finding mission on the welfare of the migrant Kenyan workers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from February 27 to March 3rd, 2019, laid on the table of the House on Thursday, August 8, 2019. Will assess that opinion say aye?
Debt ceiling for the national government.
Chair, Committee on Delegated Legislation.
I need, okay. Thank you. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move that this House adopts the report of the Committee on Delegated Legislation on its consideration of the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2019, laid on the table of this House on Wednesday, October 9th, 2019, and pursuant to the provisions of Section 205(4) of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and Section 18 of the Statutory Instruments Act 2013, and Standing Order number 210(4)B approves the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2019, thus approving the amendment made to the Public Finance Management Regulations National Government of 2015, the principal regulations through legal notice number 155
sorry,
of
Honourable,
26 September.
Sorry. It's too much noise. Sorry, Honourable Sholei, just read what is on the order paper.
Yeah.
The one on the order paper.
Okay. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move that this House adopts the report of the Committee on Delegated Legislation on its consideration of the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2019, laid on the table of this House, of the House on the Public Finance Management Act, table of the House on Wednesday, October 9th, 2019, and pursuant to the provisions of Section 205(4) of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and Section 18 of the Statutory Instruments Act 2013, and Standing Order number 210(4)B approves the amendments to the Public Finance Management National Government Regulations 2015, principal regulations as effected through legal notice number 155 of the 26th September 2019 as follows. A, in Regulation 26(1), subparagraph C, by deleting the words 50% of the gross domestic product, GDP, in net present value terms and substituting it with, therefore, the words 9 trillion shillings. And B, in Regulation 196, paragraph 1, by deleting the words net present value of the total public debt, that is, and substituting, therefore, the words set limit. Honorable Speaker, the Committee of Delegated Legislation, pursuant to Standing Order number 210, is mandated to look at all regulations that are published by the regulatory making authorities. In this regard, the committee held consultations with the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and were able to have a candid discussion and check to ensure that all the instruments and acts of parliament and the constitution had been adhered to in the making of these particular regulations. These regulations were published on the 1st of October 2019 and tabled before this House on the same date, as is required by the Statutory Instruments Act. The principal object of the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2019 is to provide clarity in terms of controls and timely oversight mechanism on the growth of the public debt. The reason for the latter is to ensure the monitoring of public debt as a percentage of the GDP makes it very difficult to enforce compliance and also undermines accountability. For this reason, Honorable Speaker, it was preferred that we provide a numerical limit to the total public debt to 9 trillion shillings in place of the current 50% of the GDP in net value terms. Honorable Speaker, the regulation also seeks to provide adequate borrowing space to cater for potential guarantees for borrowing by the county governments and state-owned enterprises. Honorable Speaker, the regulations also seek to allow the government to access concessionary funding sources from multilateral financial institutions and bilateral sources, thereby facilitating the government for interventions in the public sector. It also releases monies that would otherwise be borrowed by government from commercial banks to be able to be used by individuals, lent to individuals, and SMEs. Honorable Speaker, the rationale for the amendment is anchored on the fact that the set debt limit as currently expressed on net present value terms as a percentage of the GDP is unclear, difficult to verify compliance, and thus undermines accountability. In general terms, public debt limits are necessary for safeguarding an economy from shocks and risks, such as exchange risks, interest rate risk, international financial instabilities, safeguarding public debt at sustainable levels as envisaged in the Constitution, the Public Finance Management Act, and in accordance with international best practice. The ceiling is proposed at 9 trillion at the moment. As at the end of June 2019, public debt stood at 5.8 trillion and is expected to rise to 6.3 trillion by the end of the current fiscal year based on the approved budget policy statement by this Parliament. The amendment, therefore, will enable implementation of the budget for the financial year 2019-20 and 2020 as approved by this House. Honorable Speaker, implementation of the capital projects for the financial year 2019-2020 is highly dependent on the approval of these regulations before this House today. The government requires Kenya shillings 635 billion to finance the development projects approved by the House in this year's budget. These regulations hold the key to the funding of these projects. The amendment will also enable the nation to reprofile existing high-cost debts through debt refinancing of facilities guaranteed by multilateral financial institutions and bilateral sources to enable it pay off its expensive syndicated or what is called commercial loans. Honorable Speaker, the amendment will also enable the country to minimize domestic borrowing and allow local small medium enterprises and private sector at large to access affordable credit and avoid crowding out the private sector by confining multilateral and bilateral creditors that have lower interest rates and no longer repayment. Honorable Speaker, the net effect of this is that Kenya will be able to access loans as low as at interest rate of 1%, as opposed to the current expensive loans that have an interest rate of 9%. Consults with the Intergovernmental Budget and Economic Council in order to ensure that there is sufficient stakeholder consultation that goes up to the county level and also with the judiciary and other independent commissions in the country. Honorable Speaker, the committee therefore is satisfied that all the requirements of the Statutory Instruments Act, other acts of Parliament, the Public Finance Management Act, and the Constitution were in fact adhered to. Honorable Speaker, as I conclude, I wish to thank the members of my committee who worked tirelessly to ensure that they looked through the regulations and made sure that they were in tandem with the law. So, Honorable Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order number 210-4, and having examined the Public Finance Management Act, regulations, National Government Amendment, regulations of 2019, of legal notice number 155 of 2019, and against the Constitution of Kenya, the Interpretation and General Provisions Act, the Public Finance Management Act 2012, and the Statutory Instruments Act 2013, the committee recommends that the House adopts this report and approves the said statutory instrument as published in the Gazette notice. Honorable Speaker, I beg to move and request that Honorable
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the report from the Committee of Delegated Legislation on its considerations of the proposed amendments to the PFM regulations, Regulation 26(1)C, on the public debt ceiling. Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Committee of Delegated Legislation, we basically deal with issues to do with subsidiary legislation, guided clearly by the Statutory Instruments Act. So there's basic things that we look out for whenever regulations are brought before the committee. Though, Mr. Speaker, these ones are a little different from most of the regulations we get, because apparently these regulations, not only are they anchored in the statutory instruments, they are also under the PFM Act, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the National Treasury is responsible for the preparation of PFM regulations, and as a committee, our mandate is to ascertain, among others, the first one is whether there was sufficient public participation. This is really clearly stated in the Statutory Instruments Act. Mr. Speaker, we realize that when it comes to regulations under the PFM Act, there is also, the PFM Act itself does define who are the publics and which stakeholders are supposed to participate in public participation. And in this case, we realize that Parliament is one of them, and we know that the Treasury did consult with the Budget Committee and also the Finance Committee. We also realize that IBEC, the Intergovernmental Budget and Economic Council, which draws its membership from a lot of stakeholders, is also a mandatory participant. So basically, we believe that there was sufficient public participation because we did get the reports showing that all these bodies that are required to be consulted were consulted. Mr. Speaker, the other requirement is for us to check whether it conforms, whether any subsidiary legislation conforms with the parent act. And Mr. Speaker, we realize that a review of these regulations is provided for under Section 205 of the PFM Act, and its Regulation 6 of the PFM National Government Regulations. And this proposed amendment to the regulations is firmly anchored in the PFM Act and is consistent with the provisions of the Constitution and takes into account current and future generations. So basically, Mr. Speaker, using the Statutory Instruments Act, we feel that these regulations have passed the threshold for us to be able to pass them. But Mr. Speaker, allow me to go further and talk about the purpose of this proposed amendment, because my chair has been very ably canvassed a lot of arguments. Mr. Speaker, talking about monitoring it based on the GDP and 50% of the set target, it means that this target will keep moving, and therefore our ability to be able to monitor consistently and continuously becomes undermined. Secondly, of course, the purpose is to provide a numerical limit to the total public debt in Kenya at 9 trillion shillings in place of the current public debt limit set at 50% of the GDP in net present value. Mr. Speaker, in June 2019, the public debt stood at 5.8 trillion and is now expected to grow to 6.3 trillion by the end of this financial year as approved by Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, already we can see that the debt ceiling of this country is already quite high. And what this government required was just a little bit of space. And so the third thing that the proposed amendment requires to do is to provide adequate borrowing space, to provide, or rather to cater for potential guarantees for borrowing by both county governments also and parastatals. Mr. Speaker, if the limit is set very low, it means that we do not allow our parastatals and our county governments to be able to access funds, because they also you must note that they are part and considered as part and parcel of the public debt. Mr. Speaker, this also allows the government access to concessional funding sources. Mr. Speaker, currently, our debts are very expensive. We have borrowed, and I understand some of these debts are from commercial banks, and they are, with interest rates at the tune of 9 to 11%. If we can access concessional funding or lower, cheaper rates, then it basically means that we are saving money for the country in the long run. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it is important that we support this because it does give us an opportunity to get cheaper money. Mr. Speaker, I know that we have issues with increasing public debt, but we also must understand that as a country, we have also set up very serious infrastructural development that requires money. It is true that some people have said, and it is true, we have read it in the media, that part of the money has been lost. But, Mr. Speaker, we cannot say because there was a mistake last year or the year before, it means that from now we continue fighting and complaining. A time reaches when, as members, we must stand up to be counted. And that is why I'm saying that much as I know it is a burden even to the citizens, it is important that we stand up to be counted. It is important that now we bite the bullet and make this decision to allow the government the opportunity to be able to correct the mistakes that were there in the past. Borrow at lower rates, pay those expensive loans so that we can be able to move on and correct the country. Mr. Speaker, again, when you do that, we shift the focus from domestic debts to external debts. You see, whenever the government is doing local borrowing, it means they are competing with our SMEs and our private sector. Let us allow the government to borrow externally, lower, cheaper rates, so that the commercial banks within the country can lend to us. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, I know there's a lot I could say about it, but I want to just urge our members, let us rise up to the occasion, let us save this country. All of us are beneficiaries of public finance. We have projects in our constituencies, we have national projects, and all these projects require money. And if the CS says it needs money, we have no option, Mr. Speaker, but to support this, and then we figure out how can we control to ensure that the money the government gets does not go to waste. I second, Mr. Speaker.
Let me propose a question. Honourable members, I propose the question that this House adopts a report of the Committee on Delegated Legislation on its consideration of the Public Finance Management (National Government Amendment Regulations 2019), laid on the table of the House on Wednesday morning, October 9th, 2019, and pursuant to the provisions of Section 205, Subsection 4 of the Public Finance Management Act of 20, as effected through legal notice number 155 of 26 September 2019, as follows. A, in Regulation 26(1), subparagraph C, by deleting the words 50% of gross domestic product, in bracket GDP, in net present value terms, and substituting therefore the words 9 trillion shillings, and B, in Regulation 196, paragraph 1, by deleting the words net present value of the total public debt, that is, and substituting therefore the once set limit. Leader Majority.
No, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important matter for the country. And we are not, it's not like last Thursday. Mr. Speaker, debt ceiling are the fiscal control mechanisms that are designed to maintain the physical sustainability of any economy and are vital for the maintenance of a very healthy financial position of any country. And the Speaker, the Constitution of 2010 has given powers to Parliament in Article 201C of the Constitution and Article 211 of the Constitution and Section 50, subsection 2 of the PFM Act of 2012 that stipulates that the national government may borrow money not exceeding the limit set by Parliament. So what Parliament is doing this afternoon is anchored in law, and is anchored in law because we represent the people of Kenya. Mr. Speaker, the proposal to amend the debt ceiling or limit it is in line with the National Assembly resolution to the report on the budget and policy statement of 2019. So what we are doing is what this House passed, Mr. Speaker. If we read the budget policy statement that was brought by the Budget Committee, in its resolution, they recommended that the PFM Act should be amended to provide for a numerical debt ceiling as opposed to the current scenario where the debt is pegged on the GDP. It's very, very clear. Honorable Chair of Budget, Honorable Bandi, in the budget policy statement, they indicated, they recommended that we should go away from this thing of 50% of the GDP as to be pegged on our debt level, but we go to the numbers and say our ceiling is 7 trillion, our ceiling is 8 trillion, our ceiling is 9 trillion. So we are not doing anything out of place. In fact, we are implementing this afternoon what the Budget and Appropriation Committee recommended when they tabled the budget policy statement. Mr. Speaker, it's also important that this House fully supports the realization of a bigger, broader physical strategic targets and objectives as indicated under the 2019 budget policy statement and the midterm program given by the National Treasury. And as such, the budget policy statement of 2019, when approved, if this is approved, will go a long way in ensuring that we achieve for the first time fiscal consolidation that envisaged the reduction of the share of debt to the GDP to 44% budget deficit. Speaker, second and more fundamentally, and the country should know, this same House, when we passed the budget, we passed a deficit of 635 billion. There was a hole. And we said this will be financed through debt borrowing. And borrowing is not only in government. Even the money we use in the other arms of government is part of the borrowing. Our county governments, the money they're getting is, when we rationalize, is part of the borrowing. Mr. Speaker, debt ceilings or limits are not peculiar to Kenya as a country. These are utilized all over the world, and a determination is made by single individual countries for specific economic and physical fundamentals of that economy. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say it, the biggest mistake we made as a country, and as I go along, I will ask the National Treasury in their next meeting with the East Africa Council of Ministers of Finance, they must amend that the 50% GDP debt ceiling is the same that is used for Burundi, same used for Rwanda, is the same used for Tanzania. We are not at the same economic power level with those countries. To speak of the budget that we passed here as a country, this year, 2019-2020, was $264 billion. The budget for Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi combined is $260 billion. We have a huge economy. So you cannot compare and peg our debt ceiling at 50% like Burundi. Same at Rwanda. Mr. Speaker, it's important to know that the Kenyan economic development agenda cannot be compared with those countries in the region, and it's high time for the policymakers in the National Treasury to reconsider, and we are urging them to reconsider revisiting the macroeconomics targets that underpin the East Africa Community Convergence Framework under the East Africa Community Union Arrangement, so that we cannot be at the same level with those other countries. Mr. Speaker, national debt sustainability threshold indicate that the national debt level remains sustainable. That is very, very critical. As long as a country national debt level is sustainable, then we are doing very well. And why do I say so? For 2019-2020, Kenya debt to GDP level is projected at 59% against a debt ceiling threshold of 74%. And in present value terms, this is projected to fall to 53% by 2022 and decline as we go. So our debt level will keep on declining, because the more we invest in serious infrastructure, in energy, in roads, in rail, in airports, the drivers of the economy, the gains will be achieved in the long term. So we might borrow now, but in the future, Mr. Speaker, we will see the achievement. I'm sure those of us who are in the 10th Parliament, when President Kibaki and former Prime Minister were investing in the Thika superhighway, we thought they were joking. But today I'm sure they will be remembered for that superhighway and many, many other key energy projects. Speaker, by amending the regulations of the ratio of 50% of the debt to GDP to a numerical figure of 9 trillion was necessitated. What was the objective? Why did the government wanted us to move from 50% to the GDP to a number like 9 trillion? This was necessitated by the need to have a very clear and precise threshold that can be used for the decision making, and more so by members of parliament, even for this house, because the National Treasury tables every quarterly the debt management strategy. Now we will be in a position to collectively and individually monitor the numbers, but you cannot monitor percentage. So now going forward, the National Treasury will table and tell us these are the numbers we have borrowed, and this is how we are managing the debt level, Mr. Speaker. So it's even good for parliamentary oversight by providing express threshold that the National Assembly can use to gauge the debt performance, can use by the delegated legislation with the supporting documents by the Budget and the Appropriation Committee, has been necessitated by the need to meet and create a balance between the debt accumulation and the expenditure needs of our country. So we are trying to balance how much do we accumulate, what is our debt accumulation, balance it with our expenditure needs of our country. So it's like we are doing a scale. And the national debt, Mr. Speaker, has risen as of today to 5.8 trillion, but the country still has expenditure needs, which are very key to ensure that the Big Four agenda are achieved. We are at 5.8 today, but we look at the 4 key agenda, we will look at the key projects, and some of these projects, Mr. Speaker, are historical. The funding of the World Bank from Meru to Kulamawe to Isiolo to Wajir to Mandera. The road that will go to, I think, Mao Summit all the way to Western Kenya, the dual carriage. The expansion of the SGR from Naivasha to Kisumu to Uganda. Many, many other key energy sectors, which are the key drivers of the economy, are important for us to do what we are doing this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, it's important to know that these amendments will also ease the impact of borrowing from the domestic market by shifting the focus of the medium-term and the long-term borrowing from the domestic borrowing to external borrowing. When government borrows domestically, Mr. Speaker, they compete with the private sector. They compete with the citizens. And government stands a better chance. Government gets first priority. So the other sectors of the economy, the private sector, the ordinary citizens, Mr. Speaker, becomes victim. They are squeezed by government. So if we do what we are doing this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, I am sure government will leave the domestic borrowing and they'll go to external borrowing, and the private sector and the citizens we represent will get favorable lending rates at the domestic level, which the resulting effect, Mr. Speaker, is that there will be more resources available for the private sector, more resources available for the SMEs, thus setting the necessary conditions not to crowd in the private sector, and this will spur economic growth and employment of our young people. Mr. Speaker, I really want to ask our colleagues that we are the House that represents the people, and we are the House that have been given powers in Article 211 of the Constitution and Section 50, subsection 2 of the PFM Act, in making a determination on the debt borrowing of our country. I'm sure it has never done before the new Constitution. I really want to ask our colleagues, and even ask the Chair of Budget to drop his amendment that we pass the 9 trillion, and the report as brought by the committee. Oh, he's not here. He's here. I think yes, we ask him to drop so that we approve the report of the delegated legislation as it is. I beg to support, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable John Bandi, what's your point of order? Member for Kibwezi West.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise. I've listened very intently to what has been moved, and I'll pick issue number 1 with the issue of public participation. When we are committing the nation to borrowing 9 trillion, increasing that debt ceiling, throughout the tradition of this House, whenever we go through the budget process, whenever we go through the finance, talk about the finance bill, we've always brought external parties to inform our decisions as a House. And when we extensively look at the Statutory Instruments Act, it is very imperative, and it goes to a very large extent, to say the level of engagement that we're going to put out there. 2, and more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we've been told in the report, and I've read it quite extensively, about the engagement between the Budget Committee and the Finance Committee. And there's no annexure to what the conclusions were from those two committees, which would inform this House on what decisions we make moving forward. So I want to stand guided, Mr. Speaker, on those 2 points, and doesn't negate my opportunity to contribute extensively to it, because I'll be opposing it at every juncture, once I get that opportunity to speak from you. I want you to ably say, in the compilation of this report, because I know the Finance Committee and the Budget Committee were being seen, and those reports are not here. And to the extent that when you look at Article 152, which informs the Cabinet Secretary, to what level, and this is a ruling to you, does an acting CS commit or is able to execute statutory instruments in an acting capacity? Because in their appointment, where their roles are only reduced to two. A role to come and answer questions in Parliament, which already we've had previously, there's a challenge, and two, to be able to supply reports on a regular basis to this House. So, Mr. Speaker, I would want those things clarified, and still want to be accorded an opportunity to contribute extensively to this report. I think
you should have listened to the mover when moving the motion with regard to the issue of public participation.
I did.
You see, you cannot define public participation in a caged way. It does not, of course, require that there will be a public baraza at Uhuru Park for that to amount to sufficient public participation. On the issue of the report, I think that is a matter that the committees on finance and budget can respond. But on the issue of acting cabinet secretary, just look at Article 132 to appreciate that the president can assign any member of the cabinet to perform any functions, and when so assigned, whether in an acting or whatever other capacity, they perform, and they are answerable, responsible. Look, they are responsible to the president. They are responsible to the president. So I think that we can proceed. We can proceed without. Let's proceed with the motion. Honorable John Bandi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my brother, my friend, my classmate at Kabete Pesa, Honorable Msimba, I would just request him to bring a law on public participation, because I think we are lacking a law regulating public participation. He has a point, but I think we need to bring a law that would spell out how public participation needs to be conducted. But Mr. Speaker, let me now contribute to the motion before us. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I think we need to be very clear and understand exactly what this House is required to do this afternoon, because that is very important. We owe it to the people of Kenya as their representative. The maximum that a country can borrow, that this country could borrow, was set in law, and this Parliament was required to continuously review it. But Mr. Speaker, in 2015, somehow, we were convinced that we should join the other East African states in defining the debt ceiling or the upper debt limit for our country in terms of percentages to the GDP. Mr. Speaker, some of us have not been very comfortable with that. I actually opposed the change from absolute numbers or absolute figure to moving average, because really it is very difficult to define and for people even to understand what is the GDP of a country, and then calculating 50% of it and comparing with the debt level is usually not very easy for ordinary Kenyans. For some people it's very easy, but to many people it is not. But Mr. Speaker, we moved to a system where now, in law, Parliament amended the law to define the upper limit or the debt ceiling to 50% of GDP. As we speak, Mr. Speaker, and let us be very candid with each other, that law has been violated by the government of Kenya. The debt be able to comply with the law. And Mr. Speaker, we did pass the budget for 2019-2020. In that budget as a House, National Assembly, we told the National Executive that we could allow them to borrow 635 billion for 2019-2020. But without amending this law, Mr. Speaker, it is not possible. We cannot borrow the 635 billion. Because you cannot even borrow a shilling today, because we have reached the limit of 50% of our GDP. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, the question that this House needs to ask, and I agree with those who are expressing concern, I am one of them, about our debt sustainability. that, yes, we have borrowed money that this country is finding difficult to repay. But they could tell the government that, yes, there are projects within our budget which will be financed through borrowing, and yet there is no space for that borrowing. What, therefore, are you telling the executive? That this country is not going to implement those projects. Some of those projects, if I may mention, Mr. Speaker, if you allow me, one of them is the Ndongokundu Bridge, where we have lost 2 lives just the other day. People, the transport from Kwale to the island of Mombasa. We cannot start that project because there is a financier to finance the project, but you cannot borrow the money. Why? Because the law prohibits and stops you from doing that. There is a road that is supposed to come from, I think, Garissa to Mandera. That road is supposed to be financed through multilateral institutions. It cannot be done until and unless we come up with, we allow the executive through a legislation to borrow more. Now, the question that probably we needed to address is, should we allow the debt limit to go to 9 trillion or to a lower figure? If we borrow this year as we are planned, then the debt limit will go to 6.4 trillion. But, Mr. Speaker, the question is, should we put a figure and then come back after 2 years and review it? The answer is that is possible. In fact, that is the direction that many of us were taking. However, the argument from the executive, the argument from the treasury, which also makes sense, is that when you are dealing with multilateral institutions like World Bank, they need and they would be more confident, because World Bank is not like these syndicated loans that we are getting from commercial banks. World Bank needs transparency. World Bank needs fiscal discipline. And for them to be sure, for World Bank to be sure, for IMF to be sure that there is fiscal discipline, they need a long-term projection. They need this, for us to get into serious engagement and negotiation, loan engagement and negotiation with the World Bank and other institutions like IMF, you require something that would convince the World Bank that there is sustainability. So, Mr. Speaker, we got convinced, some of us got convinced that, yes, we need to give government a little bit more space. But again, I think this also needs to come out clearly. It is not true, as my classmate, Honorable Musimba, is saying, that we are allowing government to borrow 9 trillion. I think that is not correct. Let us be clear. And this is where we are failing as a house. From henceforth, every year we must hold the government to accountable when we are doing the budget on how much they are going to borrow for that year. What we are saying is that the government has a debt ceiling of 9 trillion. But this financial year, the amount we have allowed the government to borrow is only 635 billion. If they borrow any amount in excess of that, they will be violating the Appropriations Act and the laws that we passed in this house. So we are not telling the government to go and borrow 9 trillion. In fact, when we had a meeting with the Treasury, we were very clear with the Treasury that this 9 trillion should take Kenyans to 2024 at least, without asking us again to change the debt ceiling. But, Mr. Speaker, let me talk or say something about debt restructuring. The debt restructuring is a normal and common practice even in the private sector. Mr. Speaker, in companies, they call it balance sheet restructuring, where you can decide to ask the shareholders to come forward and buy credits or creditors, what is owed to creditors. That is what we call balance sheet restructuring. Those who are charged with the responsibility of protecting and securing the interests of Kenyans at the Treasury went ahead and borrowed very expensive loans, Mr. Speaker, for reasons that cannot be justified. They went and took syndicated loan from commercial institutions, charging interest rates at upwards of 7% and 9%. Mr. Speaker, they went ahead and borrowed locally, domestically, crowding out the private sector. In fact, the June Jomo's bill, the law that June Jomo brought here, cannot help this country much because the government is competing with the private sector in borrowing money at 12% minimum from domestically. We have gone that route and someone has taken us there. But the worst part of it is that these monies have been borrowed and have been spent in projects that cannot be identified or cannot be clearly demonstrable, Mr. Speaker. Then why would we borrow money honestly, much as it is important to sweep Kondele and make it clean? Should you borrow money to go and sweep Kondele? Because that is what we did. We borrowed Eurobond and gave to NYS to sweep Kondele and sweep Kibera and sweep other places to make them clean. That was a good thing, to make them clean, but we would have used our domestically raised revenue to do that. Because loans are expensive. You need to put it in a productive sector where it is going to be able to pay itself. Where we are now, we have financial institutions that are credible, that can give us loans at 2%, concessionary loans. Now they cannot even give us money because we have overshot the debt ceiling. We cannot do that bridge I've just mentioned, Dongokundu Bridge. We cannot do. Some people went to commercial institutions, borrowed syndicated loan at 9%, very expensive to us. We have overshot the 50% limit of the GDP, and now we have to say, because Kenyans are going to complain that we are increasing the debt level, we cannot take action. I think that will be responsibility of the highest order, Mr. Speaker. I want to conclude my contribution by saying the following, that, Mr. Speaker, the Budget and Appropriations Committee, which is chaired by Honorable Kimani Chungwa, and where I sit, we must make sure that we keep the Treasury on its toes, that they borrow this money to retire and restructure the loans that are expensive to this country, that are making us suffer as a country, that are making the future of this country become bleak. The future generation is complaining that we are mortgaging their future. So we need to do that by restructuring the debt. But you cannot, I had some arguments, Mr. Speaker, allow me to say this, because you know, matters which have, matters finance sometimes may look simple, but they are not very simple. Mr. Speaker, some people are arguing that, okay, if you want to retire, then why do you increase the ceiling? Why don't you just borrow and pay, and you remain at the same level? It is not that easy, because before you pay, it is still there. So you have to borrow first. So you have to push up the ceiling to be able to borrow, to go and pay, to reduce. Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether I'm making sense. You know, I'm now talking like I'm educating my children at home. But that is the way I would put it. That for us to be able to borrow, to retire, we have to push the limit, the ceiling up, to allow us to borrow. And Mr. Speaker, with those very many remarks, allow me to sit down and ask this House that, yes, we approve this debt ceiling, but the government must know that the people of Kenya are not happy with them for putting us in this situation. We would not be where we are today, Mr. Speaker, if there was a responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Wajir County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Committee of Delegated Legislation, which I'm the Vice Chair, and I also want to thank the Joint Committee of the Finance and Budget for actually knowing that this country is greater than individual. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank the CS National Treasury for being bold and honest. Mr. Speaker and members, the National Treasury made the regulations pursuant to Section 205 PFM Act 2012. Mr. Speaker, they have complied with the legal framework. IBEC approved the regulations. Mr. Speaker, Attorney General approved the regulations. Mr. Speaker, there was adequate and sufficient public participation because a member of delegated legislation, our key was public participation, and as a committee we were satisfied. Mr. Speaker, these regulations allows the government of Kenya to access concessional funding. Mr. Speaker, when the CS Treasury came before us, he told us he had 40 projects that needed funding. And the projects that benefit from this funding, one of it is Dongo Kundu in Mombasa, the Northern Corridor, Kenol Wamaria Nyeri Road, and Mr. Speaker, I think it is high time we approve these regulations because as a country, I think it is not a crime to borrow. Many countries did that before, but as long as there's going to be discipline in how we're going to manage the public resource. Mr. Speaker, the amendments will enable this country to minimize the domestic borrowing and allow local SMEs and private sectors to access the affordable credits. I want to urge the honorable members of this House to please look at the bigger picture as a country and support these amendments, support these regulations from the committee. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Serone Kipkorir.
To hear my views on this particular motion, Mr. Speaker, I sit in the same committee of delegated legislation, and I want to say that we scrutinize the regulation clearly, and my major point of interest is the public participation. In this case, I heard Honorable Musimba talking of the public participation. Public participation in this case, or in this particular motion, depends on which group, which body. And in that case, it was well, the public participation was well articulated and unattended. And we got the report from IPEC, whereby the same consumers, the same interest body actually did their meeting and the results were there. Mr. Speaker, my main objective on this is that when the government start borrowing locally, the SMEs actually were the major losers in this particular issue because most of the banks, Mr. Speaker, they have frustrated the common mwananchi in the private sector because of adhering to the government borrowing, which is more expensive. And without wasting a lot of time, Mr. Speaker, I really don't intend to talk so much. I just want to, because hearing the mood of the House, it's like they want the question to be put. In that case, Mr. Speaker, I totally support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Sheikh, member for Wajir South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand to oppose this motion. I stand to oppose this motion simply because let us debate facts and figures. Let us debate the reality in this country. This country requires to be salvaged from debt that is exponential. And therefore, on that particular note, I wish to say that I oppose this motion in the sense that debt ceiling must be recorded accordingly, and the amount of money that we borrow is always exponential. I want to say that I want to say quite clearly that fiscal consolidation of our budget is critical, Mr. Speaker. Let me say that quite clearly, that budget versus expenditure is what we really need to say. what I do stand to oppose particularly on, and I'm clearly saying it out, what I do clearly want to oppose is that debt ceiling must be fixed to a particular amount. That is what I'm saying, to a particular percentage. That is the key crunch point here. If it is 50%, we remain at 50%. Open-ended does not work in any books, in an accountant's book anywhere. And therefore, I do say that. Mr. Speaker, our debt percentage to our GDP is what gives the leverage to borrow. And therefore, Japan is not Kenya, or Kenya is not Japan. But our debt ceiling should be this level, then we will be giving a blank check to our debtors, to ourselves, for our debtors. And let me put it this way, our GDP growth has been sluggish. And I wonder, I'm not contradicting myself either. I want to say, I wonder whether our debt delinquency can sustain below the belt for whatever we borrow. And therefore, we must have a safeguard for what our debt ceiling will be. It must be clearly out in the report. We have to say it is this level. That is where my argument comes from. We have so far reached, in the past 78.30% of our GDP, our debt to GDP. And therefore, having come down to 58% is in itself an achievement. But that does not necessarily mean that we can borrow the much that we want. So our debt must be looked at that. Mr. Speaker, the debt ceiling must be specified. How much it is and where it will be. It must be specified. It must be clearly outlined.
Sorry.
It does not matter. We are debating. And therefore, no, that is quite exponential. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
There's a point of order. Honorable Shamala, what's your point of order? No. Be on it. Yes.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Is it in order for the Honorable Member to mislead the House? He is saying that the debt ceiling has not been specified. The debt ceiling is specified. It is numerical as opposed to percentages.
So the Honorable Member now is accordingly educated. You know, Honorable Sheikh, you may not have read what is contained here. It amounts to what you are trying to say is not there. It's just a matter of interpretation and understanding. But proceed. Proceed. Let him
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My argument stands clear. My argument stands clear.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much. So I don't need to get back to that. So I stand still by my position. We must set the limit to the particular percentage value, lest we find ourselves being bought outright like countries, anecdotally, like Zambia to China. Japan, Italy, and all that have higher debt, but they have set their particular debt on that. And therefore, I am well informed, Mr. Speaker, and I need not to be informed. The balance sheet of this country, Mr. Speaker, seems going haywire. And therefore, that is the reason that makes me stand and say that we must have that particular. There is no debt. There is no debt equilibrium. So we need to borrow more. And that should not be the case where we should be doing. So I rest my case. I say that I oppose this report until we have got clear-cut information that is out there and sufficiently discussed and debated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said my case.
Honorable Anga, what is your point of order?
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to contribute actually to the motion.
You want to contribute?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, just...
Mr. Speaker, now since you have given me, maybe I can just contribute.
Proceed.
And Honorable Muturi Kigano Senior can come after me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to state, Mr. Speaker, in support
of Honorable Kigano, what is your point of order now? You know you should not stand for long. Honorable Kigano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before my Aswell colleague came up, I was rising to under 95(1) to ask you to close the debate. Everybody understands. Please give me my space. This is not a new innovation for Parliament. This Parliament understands the whole implication of the motion. We should not waste time in debating this motion in details. Everybody understands the implication. So I'm calling.
Very well, I've heard you. I've heard you.
Yes, I'm asking you. I'm asking you to call the mover to reply.
Okay, Honorable Wanga.
Mr. Speaker, since I just sneaked into the period before he called on the question to be put for the mover to reply, and given the mood of the House from when he was speaking, the kind of cheers, I will take a very brief moment, Mr. Speaker, to make my points in supporting this motion. Mr. Speaker, no economy grows without borrowing, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you look at the data from the American economy right now, Mr. Speaker, in 2018, American borrowing was at 77% of the GDP, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that is a debt that is moving towards 100% of the GDP. So, Mr. Speaker, if we measure our debt by the percentage to the GDP, it grows scarier and scarier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the Kenyan GDP in 2018, it stood at $8.59 billion or 8.59 trillion. Mr. Speaker, if you divide that by 50%, then our borrowing was meant to be at 4.3 trillion, Mr. Speaker. If we continue to measure our GDP, our debt ceiling based on the GDP, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the GDP is a moving target. So you have to be searching for the GDP at all times to measure how much borrowing we have done. But when we put it in simple terms, we know it is 9 trillion. We know we cannot move beyond it. We know we can monitor it, Mr. Speaker, at all times. And the point that has been raised that is useful, Mr. Speaker, the fact that our debt ceiling is not raised does not mean that we are not borrowing. We are borrowing domestically. We are competing here in the local market, Mr. Speaker. And when we were speaking about Jude Njomo's bill the other day, we made it clear that right now it is very, very difficult for the private sector, small and micro enterprises to get loans from our lenders, Mr. Speaker, because we are competing with government. And when you're competing with government, there is no way the government would come for you and leave, the lenders would come for you as an individual and leave government, which is a more stable and more reliable borrower, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the most important thing, even as we do this today, is we look forward to prudent use of the monies that are borrowed. But, Mr. Speaker, the confidence that we have is because we have seen the fight against corruption that has been going on, Mr. Speaker. And we are confident that the President will continue to crack down on corruption, and that way Kenyans can be confident that their money, if borrowed, will be put to the correct use. We are seeing the people who put us in this place, Mr. Speaker, are already paying for it, Mr. Speaker. And if that continues, then we have no cause for alarm, Mr. Speaker. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to support.
Let me hear the Chair of Budget. And Chair of Budget, next time it is reported that you have not carried your card, as has just been reported. But this is too important. The Chair of Budget must.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I just happened to forget it in the court that I had yesterday. But, Honorable Speaker, I stand to support the motion by the Committee of Delegated Legislation, Honorable Speaker. And, Honorable Speaker, a number of issues have been raised. And one is the, I don't know whether to say an allegation or the contention that we are moving our debt ceiling from 50% of our GDP to what the member for Wajir was saying is an unspecified figure. But it is specified. It is 9 trillion shillings. Honorable Speaker, when you're being called upon to move the ceiling to 9 trillion shillings, what are you being asked to do? Honorable Speaker, we are not giving the government or the executive a blank check to go and borrow 9 trillion shillings. Honorable Speaker, it has been said, and I think the leader of minority said it, that every year the government comes to this house to ask this house to approve how much we shall borrow that particular year. Therefore, the ceiling, just as the ceiling to the Speaker, any time government wants to borrow, and indeed, Honorable Speaker, in the financial year 2019-2020, government submitted estimates before this house, which were considered by the Budget and Appropriations Committee. And we approved as a house and gave government permission to go out and borrow 635 billion shillings. Why? Because we cannot raise that kind of money from our tax revenues. Honorable Speaker, the absence of allowing government to open up this ceiling today is asking us to go back to the finance bill that we passed last week and levy more taxation to Kenyans to be able to raise more revenues to finance the development projects that we want in our neighborhoods, Honorable Speaker. Projects have been mentioned: Dongo Kundu, the Likoni Bridge, the Marwa, Sagana, Nyeri Road, all the way to Isiolo, Honorable Speaker, that will cost almost 60 billion, 27 or 28 billion shillings. And all this money, Honorable Speaker, we cannot raise from our own revenues unless we go out and borrow. Today, as we speak, Honorable Speaker, I think government has just been honest enough and candid to say that indeed it is true we have burst our debt ceiling. And what that means, Honorable Speaker, is that even the budget that we passed in this house in June is not implementable without opening up this debt ceiling. The current CS and current acting CS in the National Treasury and the PS cannot negotiate to borrow even a shilling today, since we have already exhausted the debt ceiling that has been put in law. So it's important, Honorable Speaker, that we understand, and I know emotionally and politically out there, it is good to say what will excite the public. But as leaders, we are being called upon to do that which is right for the nation. And Honorable Speaker, we must, as leaders, be the ones showing our people the way. And Honorable Speaker, we have been told our people are complaining, yes, the economy is bad. But the economy is not bad because we are borrowing or because we have exceeded the debt ceiling today. The economy is bad, Honorable Speaker, because there is no liquidity in the economy, because government is not spending. Yes. Since when, Honorable Speaker, did you see in this country that almost on the 10th of October, not a single shilling of development expenditure has been sent out to government ministries? Even your own CDF, those who have been here long enough can tell us, Honorable Speaker, that by now at least we would be having money for bursary, at least the first 20 million shillings for our bursary funds. Today, not a shilling of our bursary has been disbursed. Honorable Speaker, those are the issues that we are confronted with, and we must make decisions, not what is politically expedient and what is exciting to members of the public out there, but decisions on what will be right to do for the country, Honorable Speaker. I want to finish, Honorable Speaker, by giving you a story that 10 years ago, I borrowed 5 million shillings from one of the commercial banks. I was paying about 105 shillings over a period of 3 years. After about 2 years, I bought a property in Kikuyu. I borrowed another 3 million shillings over 3 years. I was paying about 154,000 shillings. I would pay every month about 335,000 shillings. I moved to one of the other banks, Honorable Speaker, to restructure, debt restructuring that the leader of minority was talking about. I took out a loan of about 10 million shillings, which I repaid over 10 years, and I ended up paying installments of about 144,000 shillings every month. What did that do, Honorable Speaker? It allowed me to grow my wealth over time. Today, the property I bought for that 3 million shillings today is worth close to about 150 million shillings today, Honorable Speaker. And my wealth has grown that way, Honorable Speaker. I was also able to be left with more money, Honorable Speaker, cash flow, cash in hand, Honorable Speaker. So when you see me donating money on a weekend, Honorable Speaker, you should know how wealth is grown, Honorable Speaker. By managing and restructuring your debt to be able to do what government is asking you to do today. That we have gone out, and I am saying at least the acting cabinet secretary has been bold enough that we are paying very huge outlays, and those huge outlays, if we are able to restructure this debt, Honorable Speaker, now, we can be able to negotiate with our multilateral institutions, restructure our debt and pay off some of these loans, release more money to go into development projects that will spur economic growth, and therefore reduce the amount of suffering and unemployment that is there with our people. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, I want to beg and plead with honorable members to rise to the occasion and show leadership to this nation. Honorable Speaker, yes, mistakes have been made in the past, but we cannot continue making those mistakes today, Honorable Speaker. And lastly, Honorable Speaker, is about the issue that have been raised on domestic debt. We have indeed crowded out completely our SMEs and the private sector from borrowing from the domestic market, Honorable Speaker. One of the perfect solutions to stop government from borrowing from the domestic market, Honorable Speaker, is to externalize most of our debt. We shall be able, through this opening up of the ceiling, to externalize most of our debt, borrow cheaply from outside, and allow the domestic financial market to lend to our SMEs and the private sector. And that is what will put money in Wanjiko's pockets, Honorable Speaker. And when we go back to our villages, Honorable Speaker, we'll not only be able to showcase the Dongokundus, the dualing of Sagana Marwa Road, and other projects, Honorable Speaker, including the road to Mandera. I heard that for the first time, that will be the first highway going all the way to Mandera. But all these things, Honorable Speaker, and the Kitui Kibwezi Road, Honorable Speaker, that Honorable Nyamai is speaking about. Yeah, Honorable Speaker, I therefore want to beg and plead with members of this House, Honorable Speaker. And lastly, let me speak to something that transpired yesterday, Honorable Speaker. And I am aware there are those members who've asked about the amendment that is here. And we have had consultations, and the Treasury has explained that they want certainty as they negotiate with the multilateral institutions. And therefore, the 9 trillion shillings, Honorable Speaker, all that Kenyans, and here I tell also Kenyans, all that Kenyans are doing, we are being asked to do, Honorable Speaker, is for everybody to understand that the 9 trillion is just a ceiling up to the year June 2024. Otherwise, Honorable Speaker, with that, I think the amendment stands withdrawn, and I would beg that we support this motion as it is. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Member for Suna East.
They are all convinced now.
I stand to support this motion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stand to support, Mr. Speaker, for the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker, when people from Treasury appear in this House, Mr. Speaker, they have been talking about, when you ask them about the country's debt, they tell you we are at 48% of the GDP. Many laymen even don't understand, Mr. Speaker, what 48, 47% means. But when you give someone a figure and you tell him, you tell him our figure of debt is 5 trillion and our ceiling is 9 trillion, Mr. Speaker, you can understand as a layman. The country layman can understand that this is what their debt is. But when Kamau Thuge and Rotich used to appear before the Public Accounts Committee, and they tell me our percentage is 48% of the GDP. Who knows first what GDP is? They have to explain first what GDP is to the people of Kenya, Mr. Speaker. Now, secondly, Mr. Speaker, and it changes, Mr. Speaker, it mutates the GDP. You know, today it's at this, next year it's at this. But when you talk about a figure, Mr. Speaker, you understand what that figure is about. But Mr. Speaker, having said that, Mr. Speaker, people who came with small parties here should not talk when the whip is talking. Mr. Speaker, the issue here is, Mr. Speaker, debts have been used in the world to revamp economies, Mr. Speaker. When the World War II happened, Mr. Speaker, the International Bank invested a lot of money in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and revamped the Europe to what it is today, Mr. Speaker, through debts, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, as much as we want to do our duty as a House to set the debt ceiling, Mr. Speaker, and to make this painful decision today, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, we must also accept the mistakes that have been committed before. Mr. Speaker, our use of debt was not prudent in this country for the last few years, Mr. Speaker. We must admit that as people. And, Mr. Speaker, we have borrowed heavily and sometimes spent money in a very awkward manner, Mr. Speaker, to the extent where we almost committed some economic genocide in this country. Convinced me that this money now might be spent in good manner, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look at the monies that were borrowed for Kamwarer, Aror, Suji what. All these monies went down the drain, Mr. Speaker, went to people's pockets, Mr. Speaker. If we are going to borrow for the same reason, Mr. Speaker, I will not be able to support this. But now I know
the war on corruption is on course, and I know that the money will be used in a prudent manner, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I'm supporting. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I sit in the House Committee of Mortgages, Mr. Speaker, and Loans, Mr. Speaker. And I've seen, when we are approving, some members whose pay slip is zero, Mr. Speaker. I don't know who's going to increase their ceiling, Mr. Speaker. I don't know who's going to increase the ceiling of these members, Mr. Speaker. Some of them are earning as low as 1,000. But having said, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask members to support this motion, Mr. Speaker, because it is in the interest of the country. If the National Treasury is going to use these borrowings, Mr. Speaker, to retire all expensive loans, Mr. Speaker, that were borrowed for special purpose vehicles of stealing, Mr. Speaker. You know, I am told, Mr. Speaker, some of the borrowings that we are going to make under this new ceiling is going to retire expensive loans that we borrowed. That's what the Treasury CS told Parliament in the committee, Mr. Speaker. And some of those monies were borrowed for special purpose vehicles, Mr. Speaker, to loot. Now, as a country, we have no option but to retire those expensive loans so that we can borrow new loans that are cheaper and that can... For the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker, we have only been paying interest on loans. We have not been paying loans. We are only paying interest, Mr. Speaker. And the Cabinet Secretary, through the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, has been bringing here the status of our debt management and guarantees, Mr. Speaker. But the Budget Committee have been sleeping on the job, Mr. Speaker. The chairman is here talking about that we... no, but I cannot talk about him. But the budget chairman, Mr. Speaker, was not doing his job, Mr. Speaker. He's sleeping on the job. He's supposed to oversight and make sure that this debt is used prudently, Mr. Speaker. We have failed our responsibility as an oversight, Mr. Speaker, doing our oversight, Mr. Speaker. Every shilling that we borrow, Mr. Speaker, this House must hold that minister to account, that PS to account for it, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Kenyan people, Mr. Speaker, it's our responsibility. That's why we have been elected to come to this House. But the chairman does rituals over years in budget making, Mr. Speaker. And this year he gave them 635 billion to borrow. Next year, I don't know, he wants to give them 1 trillion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, or 500. Mr. Speaker, the House, but through the Budget Committee Chairman, Mr. Speaker, who's aspiring to be the Minister for Finance in the Tanga government, Mr. Speaker, in 2022. Mr. Speaker, how can we elect a... Mr. Speaker, I'm very annoyed, but I support the motion, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much.
Well. Honour members, you know, the issue we are discussing is it's not a light one. And there's a reason why, you know, I must do what I must do. I want to hear the chair of Finance and Planning Committee. All these matters are finance related. Honorable Limo.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yeah, the issue which we are discussing today is a very important issue, and it is an issue which is of national importance, Mr. Speaker. And it is very important for the members to know, to understand the genesis of all this, and the best ways of giving a solution. Because, you know, as we are talking now, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sure that most of the members here are hearing for the first time the level in which the debt level, the level in which this country has gone into a debt which can be very difficult to come out if we don't address it. These issues, Mr. Speaker, has really affected the various sectors of the economy, including and not limited to SMEs. In fact, the issue which we have been talking about in terms of interest rates is being actually caused majorly by the way we have been taking our debt as a country. And to avoid repeating myself, Mr. Speaker, I want to dwell really on the issue of restructuring our loans. Currently, Mr. Speaker, as we are talking, the loans from commercial sectors is very, very high. It's almost catching up to almost half, Mr. Speaker. And for the benefit of the members, when we talk about commercial loans, these are very expensive loans from commercial banks and commercial agencies and other institutions which are charging very high interest of up to around 8%, or even 9, or even 10, depending on the negotiations. But there is multilateral and bilateral loans which are given with concessional interest, very low. You'll find IMF and World Bank normally lends at around 1, 2, or 3%, very low. And they also give very long period to pay, because, you know, they consider that these are countries which are sustainable, like Kenya. Kenya has been placed very well. So what I want to say, Mr. Speaker, is that when we approve this, the National Treasury, and I must also state here that we have seen the acting CS. We have had several meetings, and it looks to be in the line of understanding. And I hope you will not fall into the trap of the mandarins who will show him how to go to the deep end, where the country will go deeper and deeper into debt. The way to go, Mr. Speaker, is for the National Treasury, led by the acting CS, to take the issue of restructuring our loans seriously. They must retire all commercial loans, because in 2012, the commercial loans were at 8%. Right now, they are over 36%, which is very serious. So once this is done, and I want members to understand, it is just the same way if you have loans in commercial banks, let's say KCB, Equity, Co-Bank, and you retire them, you can retire them by borrowing at a low interest rate at the SACCO, and then you retire them, and you will be relieved. If you are paying a loan at 200,000, if you go to cooperatives and you repay all of them, you will be able to repay, let's say, at 150, and your pay slip will be improved. That is a very simple example of how the government can relieve this country from repaying a lot of loans by restructuring and ensuring that all these commercial loans are retired by borrowing from IMF and repaying all these commercial loans. And in so doing, Mr. Speaker, the government will not have the urge of borrowing up to 600 billion in a year. They can actually maybe borrow 400, and therefore we'll get a relief of around 200 billion. It is a very good example, Mr. Speaker. I want to clarify that when we also borrow from multilateral agencies, we will stop borrowing from the local market, and it will actually release funding to our SMEs. And this will actually stop the issue of the urge to release capping from in the market, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say this. Let us support this. Let us give the chance to the National Treasury to negotiate for better loans, and it will bring back the country to where it is supposed to be. Mr. Speaker, I urge this House to support, to help the country go back to the track. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So, okay, honourable members, I think there is a... No. Now, honourable members, I hear you. There was a member for Kangema who rose in his place and claimed that the mover be called upon to reply. I've also heard some of you are finding it difficult to sit. You are saying it. Honourable members, let me find out what it is that the House desires. And therefore, I put the question that the mover be called upon to reply. The mover be called upon to reply. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. Will as many as a contrary opinion say no? Nay. Oh, sorry. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mover. Honorable Sholei.
Honorable Speaker, I beg to reply. I will just make 2 points. One on the issue. The most important point is that public participation was undertaken, and proof of public participation was provided to the committee. Advertisements were done in the media and conducted in compliance with Section 5 and 5A of the Statutory Instruments Act. Yes. Yes. And point number two is that
You thank the members.
yeah, no. Okay. And point number two is that the committee was persuaded that setting a numerical figure to the debt ceiling is better for accountability than putting the GDP, because Kenya is an oil producing country.
So you reply. I reply.
Okay. Honorable Speaker, you should protect me. They are not giving me an opportunity to complete this. Yes. So, Honorable Speaker, I beg to reply.
Honourable members, I therefore put the question that this House adopts a report of the Committee on Delegated Legislation on its consideration of the Public Finance Management (National Government Amendment Regulations 2019) laid on the table of the House on Wednesday today, 9th of October 2019, and pursuant to the provisions of Section 205, subsection 4 of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and Section 18 of the Statutory Instruments Act 2013, approves the Public Finance Management National Government Amendment Regulations 2019, legal notice number 155 of 26th of September 2019, thus approving the amendment made to the Public Finance Management National Government Regulations 2015, in brackets, principal regulations, as follows. A, in Regulation 26, subsection 1, subparagraph C, by deleting the words 50% of gross domestic product, in brackets GDP, in net present value terms, close the quotes, and substituting therefore the words, in brackets, 9 trillion shillings, close the brackets, and B, in Regulation 196, paragraph 1, by deleting the words, in brackets, net present value of the total public debt, that is, in brackets, close the brackets, and substituting therefore the words, set limit. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. Will as many as of contrary opinion say no? The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Next order. Next order.
Order number 12, motion.
Next
petition
order.
By the executive for the variation of the boundaries of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve.
The chairperson, Honorable Karege Mbioki.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion.
Honourable members, there's still business.
On the report of the consideration
we are still
of
in the business. Sorry, honourable members.
Supported the degazettement of the Chepwalk Forest Phase 2 and 3. The committee also noted that the residents of Chepkitale disagreed with the assertion made by the executive in the petition that Chepwalk Phase 2 and 3 was intended would be an exchange for Chepkitale and were not ready to discuss the relocation from Chepkitale. Mr. Speaker, the Joint Committee further noted that the government had facilitated due process for the gazettement of Chepkuyuk, Phase 2 and 3, which included conducting public participation, seeking approval from the Kenya Forest Service, and conducting the environmental impact assessment to ascertain that the gazettement would not endanger the biodiversity. The committee further observed that the petition discloses adequate grounds for the variation of boundaries of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve by 4,607 hectares, given the security challenges associated with the land in Chepyok. Mr. Speaker, however, the mechanism should be put in place by the government to ensure that only deserving person benefited in case the request for the gazettement is approved by the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, in response to the prayers by the petitioner, the Joint Committee argued that pursuant to Section 334 of the Forest Conservation and Management Act 2016, the National Assembly approves the variation of boundaries of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve to exclude Chepwalk Phase 2 and 3 comprising 4,607 hectares. Further, the Joint Committee urged this House to resolve that the government should properly secure the remaining forest area within Mount Elgon Forest Reserve, particularly the Chepkitale, considering the need to achieve the United Nations recommended 10% forest cover in the country. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I beg to move. And I now call upon the Vice Chair of the Environment and Natural Resource Committee, the Honorable Sophia Abdinur, to second. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Ijara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this chance to second this motion. Mr. Speaker, and as a committee, the Joint Committee, we were very sensitive and very alive to the fact that Kenya adopt and approve. Mr. Speaker, considering the petition, the Joint Committee had various meetings. We had a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of Lands and Fiscal Planning, and we deliberated on the issue in depth with the minister and experts from their team, from the ministry. We also had a meeting with the Chief Administrative Secretary of Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And we talked, and we were very open, in particular discussing on the forest cover of this country, so that we as a country, we need to meet the demands and the standards of forest cover. So we were able to engage and interact properly with the Chief Administrative Secretary, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Joint Committee also undertook a field trip to Bungoma County. We had 2 days meeting in Bungoma County where we met with several stakeholders. We met with the Ondiek and the Dorobo community elders, Council of Elders. These are the gatherers and hunters who live in those forests, Mr. Speaker. And we met with them so that we could understand what they think of the proposals that we were fronting as Joint Committee, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we also met with various groups. We also received submission from various stakeholders following an advertisement that we placed in the Daily Nations on the 26th of July 2018, in line with Article 118 of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this report is to respond to the prayer made by the executive, Mr. Speaker. In the said petition, the Joint Committee having considered all the views collected, Mr. Speaker, they observed that the approval of a legal notice to effect the variation of the
even the recommendation in number 2, which I agree with, is need to, Mr. Speaker, it says the government should properly secure the remaining forest area within Mount Elgon Forest Reserve, particularly in Jebukitale, considering that the need to achieve the United Nations recommended 10% forest cover in a country. Mr. Speaker, in the first recommendation, it is talking about 4,607 hectares. In the second recommendation, there is no mention of the size of the forest to be secured. It becomes ambiguous, Mr. Speaker. And this is where I have a problem. If you look at what has been provided, and I thought maybe if I should be getting some amendment to this report, Mr. Speaker, so that it covers specific actions to be undertaken so as to protect the forest. And I thought it should have even come up with a recommendation that in all areas where indigenous trees have been cut down, they need to be planted in those areas and the shamba system done away with. Because as we speak now, Mr. Speaker, some rivers are drying. Downstream, the rivers from Mount Elgon are, the levels of water, amount of water is diminishing. And given there is no effort to take care of the forest, we're going to lose out so much, Mr. Speaker. So the committee has acted on a petition, it's done its work to bring a report to the House. But if we are not careful, Mr. Speaker, this is another Mao summit conflict you are trying to create in Bungoma. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the area you're talking about, Jebukitale, is about 20,000 hectares, which is not mentioned here in the recommendation. And how this is going to be covered, Honorable Asiali attempted to explain, this is Ndorobo. It was previously occupied by Ndorobo, and in fact ought to have been community forest, held in trust, for the people, the Ndorobos of Mount Elgon, Mr. Speaker. So you are not solving the problem by just degazetting it, because there are people called the Ndorobo there, and they are there as we speak. There are people living in that forest. You're not doing this for the support land defense forces, Mr. Speaker. The defense forces, support land forces, defense forces are also in the forest. And if you think by degazetting this you're solving the problem, you may even be aggravating it more. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to call for caution as we get into this. This is a very emotive issue, and particularly for the communities in Mount Elgon. Unfortunately, my brother, Honorable Kapondi, is not here. But this is a matter which is very sensitive, and we must be alive to that fact, that if we are not careful, we're going to create another Mao summit. Mr. Speaker, Jebukitale was lawfully held as trust land by Bungoma County Council since independence on behalf of the Ogegi or Dorobo community. And it needs to be noted that Jebukitale unregistered community land, and therefore ought to have been held as trust land, in trust of the people, the Ndorobos themselves. Changing it is also going to cause problems because the Ndorobos are there, and you cannot take them out of the forest. If you want to hold it in trust, yes, provide alternative. Because measures that we are putting in place, to solve the problem may lead us to not solving the problem. This is, Mr. Speaker, in fact, it is, this is provided in Article 63(2) of the Constitution of Kenya. This community land ought to have been vested, as Ogig community land. I'm not a member of that community, but as a major stakeholder in Bungoma, I am aware there is bound to be a problem unless this matter is handled properly. There is also bound to be a problem of deforestation. The forest that has been destroyed, which is not mentioned here, thousands and thousands of hectares through the Shamba system has been destroyed. So, Mr. Speaker, there should be clear demarcation of boundaries between Mount Elgon gazetted forest and Jepkitali community land. Unless this is provided for, you still must expect that there's going to be conflict between the communities, the forest, and the general population in Bungoma, Mr. Speaker. The county government, in whose, where Jepkitali land falls, pursuant to section 12 and 13, 3D of the Community Land Act, number 27 of 2016, should facilitate proper and sustainable management of the land with the Ogig community involvement. They have to be involved in this. So, Mr. Speaker,
Honorable Uhuru, your space is gone, but I'm sure you clearly made your point. No, Honorable Uhuru, you may not get that 1 minute, because if I give you 1 minute, Honorable Ole Sankok, who is next, would also ask for a minute. Honorable Afura, let's give him 30 seconds to finish that bit. 1 minute, Honorable Afura. I don't know why you said you are a serious stakeholder in Bungoma, but anyway, please.
Why do you want to doubt that, Mr. Speaker?
I have not doubted, Honorable Afura Munyinyi.
Mr. Speaker, I am, of course, the point I'm driving at is as a leadership. The people in Mount Elgon, those Dorobo, ought to have been involved, and it should be acknowledged that this is a matter that touches on the Constitution, it touches on existing law. These recommendations are good, yes, but given the need to involve the others and other stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, and which I recognize, I would like to state that I will be introducing at some point amendments to this report so that it captures the spirit to ensure, first, we protect the interest of the community, second, to ensure that also the Constitution is respected. With those few remarks, otherwise, Mr. Speaker, I support the attempt to resolve the dispute in Mount Elgon, Bungoma County. I thank you, Mr.
Honorable Ole Sankok.
Thank you very much, Honorable Speaker, to allow me to speak in such a very important matter in this House. Honorable Speaker, and from the onset, I oppose this particular report. And there is no way our government, in fact, for the first time, I'm ashamed to be a member of the Jubilee administration. Because there is no way, Honorable Speaker, we can have all these problems of drought all the way from the north to the south, all the way from the east to the west of our country, and the same government, which is supposed to be protecting this forest, is now purporting to bring petitions to petition this House to degazette part of the forest in the name that Ndorobos have always been living and Ogek inside the forest. If they have been living inside the forest, why degazette it in the first place? Let them live in the forest when it is still a forest. It is another way of the government trying to grab, because, Honorable Speaker, the government have become the highest grabber of our forest. If it is not because of the government, we will not be fighting in Mao. Because of the government, that is why there is problems of deforestation in this country. Because of the same government, Honorable Speaker, our forest cover is now at 1.7% against the required 10% forest cover for us to be at least at minimum comfortable, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, it is because of this government that have encouraged into Mau Forest, that have made people follow the government into Mau Forest, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, if there was no roads in Mau Forest, no citizen of this country can buy land in Mau Forest because they will know it is automatic, it is a forest. The government must first of all explain how schools, government schools, sponsored by CDF, sponsored by the government, are found inside Mau Forest. The government must first of all explain how teachers, duly paid by government, TSC teachers, are teaching in Mau Forest. And I doubt if monkeys need some lessons or some classes, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the government must first of all explain before bringing any petition of grabbing another forest how chiefs are inside Mau Forest, how electricity was connected into our forest before they bring any petition of alienating part of our forest, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the drought that we are facing, our people are dying, Honorable Speaker. We are beggars, literally, in 80% of our land mass, Honorable Speaker, of the arid and semi-arid areas, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, we are tired as pastoralists from borrowing and begging from the government and from other quarters, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the highest job now for Red Cross is to feed some of our masses due to failed rains, Honorable Speaker, due to deforestation, Honorable Speaker. We are tired, Honorable Speaker, of having individuals, including people like Akode, donating foodstuff to people who can be self-reliant if our forest cover was at minimum 10%. We are at 1.7%, and they want to grab to take us where? To take us to 0%, Honorable Speaker. We cannot allow this. This House must stand its own feet and reject this report and not allow the government at any instant to grab an inch of any forest. If anything, we will urge the government to come up with ways of increasing our forest cover, including planting trees in all our public institutions, including schools, including chief camps, including health centers, road reserve, riparian areas. Let the government plant more trees to increase our forest cover, but not grab even an inch of our forest. We should, whether we have conflict or not, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, those people who die because of those conflicts are not better than those who are dying of thirst and of hunger, Honorable Speaker. Millions of us, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, our rivers are drying, Honorable Speaker. It was for the first time in history when I'm in Narok, Honorable Speaker, River Wasonguro dried, Honorable Speaker. Mara River dried, Honorable Speaker. Siabe River dried. Sontu Mirio, the Sontu River was reduced, the water level was reduced. Our electricity from Sontu Mirio is reduced, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, we cannot allow, in fact, if anything, we should be getting petitions from this government to alienate part of our holding grounds into forest, Honorable Speaker. We will get petition from this government to go and conserve bony forest, Honorable Speaker. We will be getting petition of the government asking for funds from this House to allocate to fencing of Mau Forest, fencing of Mount Elgon Forest, fencing of Boni Forest, and other forests, Honorable Speaker. We will be getting petition from the government of how they can develop forest in the middle of arid areas, including Marsabit and Mandera and part of Narok and Kajiado, Honorable Speaker. We will not, this House will be in history books if it allows an inch of any of our forests, while our forest cover is at 1.7%. If we were at 15%, we will negotiate. If we were at 20%, we will negotiate. If we were at 11%, we will negotiate. But anything below 10%, all our forests must be conserved. And it beats logics that those we have put in power, the Ministry of Environment, which is supposed to conserve our environment. which is supposed to protect our water towers, is the same ministry that come with a petition here that it want to grab part of our forest so that it can settle some people that they purport have always been living in the forest. If Ogieks are expert in living in the forest, let the forest remain and let the Ogiek live there. But I still repeat my statement that our forests are for monkeys, animals, and not human beings. Human beings, we only need 10% of our land mass. That translates to, Honorable Speaker, 14 million acres. All the rest, 126 million acres of the land mass of Kenya is for human settlement. Please, mutosheke na hiyo. Wacheni musitu, in quotes, Honorable Speaker.
Order.
Honorable Speaker, sorry. It was in quotes. So, Honorable Speaker.
It cannot be in quotes, Honorable Sakok. Don't try to circumvent.
Sorry, Honorable Speaker. Sorry, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, so as I finish, Honorable Speaker, we need to conserve our forests. And the least we expect from the Ministry of Environment is not to grab part of the forest, but to tell us how we can conserve the forest. I urge this House to stand in the right side of history, because we will be judged in future if we allow an inch of our forest to be grabbed. As a resident of Narok, Honorable Speaker, I have faced dramatic drought. I have seen people dying. I have seen animals dying. I have seen even our tourism almost collapsing, Honorable Speaker. I have seen children suffering from communicable diseases because of dirty water, Honorable Speaker. Long are the days when we used to drink clean water from springs, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, this country must go back to where it was in terms of environment in the 1980s. It must go back there. It cannot go back there when it is the government that wants to grab our forests. The government must stop grabbing our forests. Honorable Speaker, with those very many remarks, I oppose.
Shall we have Honorable Ganya Chachu?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to support this motion, which is on the consideration of a petition by the executive regarding the violations of the boundaries of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve. So, Speaker, sir, from the outset, I support the motion. I'm a member of this committee. Mr. Speaker, sir, conservation must have human face. If we have to have sustainable conservation in this country, we must realize that human beings are part of that ecosystem. They are part of that habitat. And if we want to conserve our forest and our environment in a way that is sustainable, that will, Mr. Speaker, sir, really be managed in a way that will be effective in its use. Mr. Speaker, sir, it's critical that we actually look at all issues holistically. It's important to realize that humans are part of that ecosystem. Those Ndorobos who are living in that forest, that's their home. Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the variation of, in supporting this motion, and being a member of this committee, we even made a field visit to this region. Mr. Speaker, sir, this variation basically will enable the people who have lived in that ecosystem for almost the last 50 or so years to have a home. Mr. Speaker, sir, whether we set this land aside for them or not, they will still live in that forest, they will still utilize that forest, and Mr. Speaker, sir, will not even have sustainable land use practice because they will not call that their home, they have no title to that land, they will not be able to develop that land. We will not have a sustainable land use practice if this is not regularized, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, relevant government authorities, such as the Ministry of Land and Planning, Physical Planning, National Environment Management Authority, Kenya Forest Service, and all other stakeholders have looked at this issue critically. They give it a very hard look and eventually made a decision, and as a government, the decision was made to petition Parliament so that we can vary these boundaries and enable these people to access this land and settle. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is coming to us simply because, as Parliament, we are the only ones with the constitutional mandate to really vary boundaries of forest or even national parks. And it's only through a resolution of Parliament that this could be done. And that's why this before this House, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, two departmental committees of this House, Committee for Lands, the Departmental Committee for Lands and the Departmental Committee for Environment and Natural Resources actually jointly made assessment of this petition. And we all concurred that there is a need to agree with the government on their request for this petition. And if you look at our report, we are all in agreement. There isn't any single dissenting view. And Mr. Speaker, sir, a committee of this House, especially two departmental committees, given the task, and if they done it well, I'm sure they are able to guide this House on to do what is right. Mr. Speaker, sir, environmental impact assessment was done, and in setting this land apart, or in varying the boundaries of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve, it will not have any degrading impact on the ecosystem and the ecology of that environment. Mr. Speaker, sir, more than that, we do feel that if this is done well and people are settled and we are able to conserve the rest of the forest, then we will have a very good land use system in place. We will be able to conserve the water towers and the entire ecosystem of Mount Elgon Forest, and people will be able now to leave the forest and live, Mr. Speaker, sir, where they have been given the land. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also have to appreciate that this particular petition is from the executive. It's actually from the executive arm of our government. And they're the ones who are saying, look, it is time we vary these boundaries and give these quotas, or these people who are living in this land for the last 50 years or so, a space and a home, so that they are able to use that land effectively, knowing that it's theirs. Once they have the titles, they will be able to develop it, and Mr. Speaker, sir, make a good use of it and boost the local economy and the entire economy of Bungoma County. Mr. Speaker, sir, from our consideration, it will not have any impact, negative impact, on the entire ecosystem of Mount Elgon Forest Reserve or the entire biodiversity. This has been done by Kenya Forest Service by doing a very elaborate environmental and social impact assessment. But Mr. Speaker, sir, having said that, the issue is the implementation. We may pass a resolution in this House, as you have done in the past. I still remember, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the last Parliament, in the 11th Parliament, we passed a resolution here, and the same Committee of Environment and Natural Resources, of which I was a member even then, we passed a resolution to enable Bangale and Bambala Forest Reserve in Tana River County to be set aside so that people could be, actually not set aside, but actually to enable people who have lived there all these years to own the land. And that was a resolution that was passed in this House. 5 years, 4 years or so down the road, nothing has been implemented. It's as if we debate in vain, we pass a resolution in vain, and then this is a constitutional mandate that you have been given to this House. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, we may even pass this resolution today, but 5 years down the road, maybe nothing will be implemented. This could be different because this came from the executive. Maybe it's in their interest to implement this particular one, but the ones that were actually brought by people to us, where resolution was passed in this House, I can tell you for sure, to date, we are being told by members of Parliament from those counties that it's yet to be implemented. So at times you wonder why even we pass resolutions if it's not acted upon by the executive. But I think that's something for the implementation committee of this House to ensure that whatever we have passed in this House is not in vain and is implemented. So, Speaker, as I conclude, I do hope that once the House decides one way or the other on this, and I hope they'll agree with the two joint committees and pass this resolution positively, I hope it will be implemented. And these poor people, these Dorobos who have lived there for all these years, will have a place to call home. I support the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Before I get to my left, let's have the Honorable Deputy Speaker.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be very brief. I support this the resolution arising out of this petition. And I must say first, this is a very new phenomenon which arises from our Constitution. It is something that is very good. This particular one, I support it because I know first the difficulties that those communities in the Mount Elgon area have gone through in the last probably 10, 15 years. Mr. Speaker, there is something that must be very clear. Number one is that there must be a symbiotic relationship between the forests and the human beings, and the human race. It should be known that these people in Mount Elgon are the people who took care of this forest for a long time. It's only that the issues have changed over time. It is now that you cannot be able to utilize your land properly without the proper documentation. So we must be sensitive. This is one thing that if it is done, we will be able to assist those people so that they can also benefit like other Kenyans. And there are going to be a few other petitions which will be coming of a similar nature. I will tell you, for example, in Kuresoi North constituency, we have brought in a petition of a similar nature, but different in a dimension, where we are asking the government to give us 10 acres, only 10 acres, of land which is already occupied by government. The petitioners are petitioning the Ministry of Environment to help them degazette 10 acres of a land that is already occupied by government itself. So it's government to government. So when I see members, like for example, I saw nominee 001 vehemently opposing and saying that government is grabbing, well, I thought it was a bit insensitive. Where he comes from, for example, he would be very happy to say, let's take care of Mau. And if you go to his land, he has absolutely no tree that he has planted, not a single one. Now, this is what we are saying, Mr. Speaker. We must learn to be honest with each other. Everybody must participate in conservation of forest. It should not be left to some specific communities or areas. It cannot be left to the people of Mount Elgon to take care of forest on behalf of the rest of us.
I'm not sure, Honorable from you want to. What is the intervention for? You look quite agitated.
Mr. Speaker, nobody can believe that the member, the Honorable Deputy Speaker is referring to, has never planted a tree. Imagine. Never planted a tree, Mr. Speaker. I have been to his home, yes, and I have seen trees. He has planted trees on his land, Mr. Speaker.
If you saw trees, you can't be sure he's the one who planted.
He planted the trees, Mr. Speaker.
I have no reason at all to have a problem with a very senior member of this House. And I know the truth. He has actually been to a place called Osim, or Nosim for that matter, where my good colleague here lives. And I have been there myself. And I am a conservator. I know about trees. I have lived inside forest. I know trees that are planted and those who grow which grow on their own. I know what my honorable colleague has done is to actually build a house on top of a tree, utilizing trees. It is a benefit that he gets by using a tree that has grown over a long period of time, and he built a honeymoon house up there using the tree. And that is exactly what I am saying, that we must be able to benefit from the trees so that as human beings, we are also tempted to protect that particular tree. So when Honorable Wamunyinyi says he's been there, I have been there myself and ate some very, very nice meat in his house, and he's my friend, and he knows it, and we have been very close. And when I say that he has not planted trees, I know what I am saying. What I know is that in his compound, there are some trees that grew, and he has been able to manage them, but he did not plant them. So what I'm just saying, and on a more serious note now, Mr. Speaker, what I'm just saying is that forest must be able to be of use to human being in terms of when you conserve, you know there is some benefit. Where I come from, which is Kuresoi North, we plant trees, and therefore it's as good as our cash crop. So we harvest them when they are mature. Otherwise, they will be destroyed. They'll go for nothing. So we harvest. Unfortunately, most of the time, it is not the locals who harvest those trees. The licenses are given to people who are from distant areas. But that is not a story for today. That's for another day. What I'm saying today is that these people of Mount Elgon have suffered in a long time. And my good friend, Honorable Amunyinyi, knows that in those particular areas, there have been even security issues. You remember there is one time that there had to be deployment of military, not police, military personnel to go and take care of them, and yet it is about conservation of their own land, which they have conserved over a long period of time, which they have been able to manage, and therefore we should allow them to enjoy the benefits and toil of their sweat. This is even biblical. Even for nothing else, it is biblical. When you plant something, you harvest it. It is in the Bible. And you know I didn't write the Bible. I found it there. Now, this is what I am just saying, Mr. Speaker, that as we castigate these people who have conserved forests for a long time, we must also be sensitive that they are humans and they are supposed also to benefit in terms of direct use of that land so that they can be able also to grow economically like every else of Kenya. By the way, I do not think the government or any other institution compensates them for keeping the forest. You know, a government like Kenya can be compensated by being given something called carbon credit. But carbon credit has not gone to individual farmers and individual human beings who live in those forests. These are things that we need to consider. These are things we need to consider so that when I have land, like I have some land myself, I am given an opportunity to plant trees for taking care of this environment on behalf of the humanity. That is what is critical. So what I'm just saying, and I'm very happy that these people, and by the way, this is a government, this is the Ministry of Environment, this is the government, this is executive saying, I think these citizens of ours deserve this. I think that is a very key thing. It's good. It's a constitutional phenomenon that came out of the 2010 constitution. And therefore, they have taken that advantage. As in Kuresoi, we were not very greedy. We decided, and we asked, is 10 acres going to be sufficient? We said we don't need more. 19 acres has been cleared. Government is already occupying it. We don't want the entire 19 acres. We want actually to help government plant 9 acres. But we don't want to use another amount from government to go and buy land far from where it is. It is in a town called Kuresoi. We want to build a DO's office. We want to build DC's office. We want to build county offices. We want to build agriculture offices, and in only 10 acres. And somebody will come here and say, no, never, don't give them. And yet, we are not even the ones who participated in clearing that particular forest. So that is why I'm saying what these people have done is good. What the people of Kuresoi have done is very good. By not asking for 1,000 acres to settle even some of the other people who are landless. We have said first, before even we go to the settlement issues that we need to consider, let us first take advantage and have government come closer to the people so that we can be able to speak to government and tell them, look, there is something more we require. So those are the kind of things that we are saying are good, and it's good. So I beg to wind up my contribution on this and beseech members that kindly allow the Mount Elgon people of very small, of a very small community, the Ogiek, very few people. Let them benefit. Let us utilize. If we want to get to 15%, by stopping the Mount Elgon people from utilizing that small land, it does not give us the percentage that we require. We would probably be taking, I do not even know what kind of decimal to use, an extremely negligible decimal. Let us see ways of trying to conserve environment. We want this environment to benefit human beings, and therefore we want to plant trees. We want to see those areas that are supposed to be conserved, we conserve them, but those ones which the human beings are supposed to utilize, let them benefit from it. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Very well. Let's have Honorable Mabonga Mwambu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a nice report based on actually the recommendation of the United Nations that each country has at least to have 10% of its country, of its space to forest. But however, Mr. Speaker, I have some reservations
on some of the recommendations that have been submitted in this report. And it's important, Mr. Speaker, you've listened to my senior from the same county, that is Bungoma County. Mr. Speaker, I don't think a problem solves a problem. And that has been the challenge with this government. Because the government is very quick to molest its own people without even proper plans in place. I am a resident of Bungoma County, Mr. Speaker, where Mount Elgon is. And Mr. Speaker, I've looked at the report very keenly, and you can see very clear dissenting voices from the local community. In Mount Elgon, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, if you resettle or you allow one community to stay or to remain in the forest, you realize they're calling the forest their ancestral land. And at the same time, a portion of other community, you are displacing them, you are bringing conflict, Mr. Speaker. So it's important, before the government thinks of recovering the forest space that they want to recover, Mr. Speaker, they need to have a proper implementation plan. And if anything, if the government is serious to acquire the 10%, they know very well, Mr. Speaker, where the forest was by the time of independence. Interestingly, people even who have issued title deeds to today, Mr. Speaker, you will be surprised to find them in the office with the promotions. So, Mr. Speaker, this one raises a lot of reservations. It's our duty, Mr. Speaker, that before we begin actually to move people out of the forest, we need to know the acreage that the committee is talking about. How many people are going to be affected? We don't want to see the same scenario, Mr. Speaker, like the Mau forest that we are seeing today. Children are crying on the road, and the same government is watching. Schools are being brought down. The same government that used the money is watching. So which kind of investment are we doing? So, Mr. Speaker, the best thing they could have done as a committee, they need to come here and tell us actually how many forest acreage are they going to recover, and from there, what percentage is it going to contribute to the 10% that they want? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, they need to tell us where they're going to take these people. Or else in Mount Elgon, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, if you settle one community and leave the other community in the forest, you are creating a problem, Mr. Speaker. And being a neighbor to Mount Elgon, I know the problem will definitely spill even to my constituents. So, Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of reservation on this. Yes, we need to reserve and at least conserve our water towers like Mount Elgon. It's very important. But the government must take its responsibility by ensuring that the people who are in the forest are resettled, Mr. Speaker. We don't want to sit here, Mr. Speaker, and see Kenyan children suffering on the road just because the government wants to implement its policies. Mr. Speaker, another thing I've realized that in most of the things that are happening today, many directives are being issued by the Cabinet Secretary in charge of various ministries or departments. But interestingly, Mr. Speaker, some things or reports comes here, we discuss, but there is no proper follow-up of what they're doing. We don't see a proper monitoring policy of whatever that they're implementing. Because like today, we could be seeing at least in Mount Forest, we've recovered this. This has increased the percentage up to this level. So as we move to the next water tower or to the next forest cover, this is what we're going to achieve. It's not clear anywhere. That is why even when you ask of the acreage, they will point one place and the other place they leave it empty, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this forest, when the Speaker says actually, the Deputy Speaker has said to the member of Krusoi, that indeed there are people who have been in charge of this forest. That one I agree. And they have even raised their voice in this submission that that land is their ancestral land. Where are you going to take these people? before you do any kind of implementation. Mr. Speaker, we need to know where you're going to take these people, because we know the kind of people they are. People who live in the forest. Mr. Speaker, you cannot just wake up today and tell them, now I'm removing you from the forest. Where you will take your animals, we don't care. Where you will take your children, we don't care. You are creating a problem, Mr. Speaker. And that is why we are concerned as Bungoma stakeholders that we need to know. And even some of us could have been called to appear before this committee to raise our issues. I hope we still have some space to do the same. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to have my reservation on this report that we need to have more time, engage the community, engage the leadership. In Mount Elgon, we have different sub-tribes that need to be involved before this kind of program takes off. This report, from my position, Mr. Speaker, I oppose it.
Honorable Jeremiah Kioni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that opportunity to contribute to this motion. On the onset, I want to recognize that we are able to discuss this motion because the government has been faithful, at least on this issue, to the requirements of the Constitution. These are the gains that we gave ourselves with the 2010 Constitution. There before, Parliament would just have gone ahead, not Parliament, the Executive would just have gone ahead and grabbed the rod in whichever way that they thought necessary and given to the people who perhaps sang to their tune. But with the provisions in our new constitution, we are able to go through these motions so that we can hear the views that we have had. A little bit earlier on in the day, Mr. Speaker, also we saw the new constitution at play, where Parliament was requested to do what many of us did not know was the responsibility of Parliament, that is setting the debt ceiling for ourselves as a country and allowing the executive only to borrow up to a given extent. But Mr. Speaker, that issue has arisen now. Listening to Mheshimiwa Munyinyi and also the member who has just spoken from the region of Bungoma. And this is the issue of public participation. When we've been called to do public participation, I think we are taking it for granted, because I was asking the vice chair of the committee that has tabled this good report whether there was an opportunity for the members to inform the report even before it came to the floor, and she is telling me that that was available, because their sentiments are crucial. They come from this area, and we cannot pretend to be solving problems when we are this far, when the people who are near there have not quite gone by what we are saying. But the fact that there was an opportunity to do it at the right time, of course, takes it away from them. They cannot come and try and shoot it at this late stage. They should have done it a little bit earlier. And it tells you, Mr. Speaker, because even as I'm saying this, they are in the house and they cannot tell that I'm actually hitting at them. And I can only wish them a nice evening. But they were very eloquent in saying what they should have said a little bit earlier. Before I even say anything about this report, Mr. Speaker, I want to weigh in on an issue that was a little bit earlier. We had the issue of the debt ceiling. And this member from Wajir South, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, had a dissenting position. And what horrified me was that as members of this parliament, we couldn't give you an opportunity to debate. We got to a point of heckling him. And I think that's a bit, for lack of a better word, it's a bit primitive. It's not what we expect from our members. It's good to let them say what they want to say, because he really had issues points that he was raising as to whether he was able to convince people on his side. That's why we are here to debate. So when we have, one of the best hecklers was the man you called 001, this member of the nominated member.
Order, Honorable Kioni. I'm not sure you want to go that route because the member is not here. I am sure he is not that very
Mr.
strong
Speaker,
name you are referring.
The last thing I would want to do, Mr. Speaker, is to argue with you. But,
yes, you can't. That you can't.
Mheshimiwa Sankok is not a stranger to this. He has chosen not to be
What
here.
is it? What is it, Honorable Wafula Munyi?
Mr. Speaker, you cannot allow the Honorable Chair to get away with that kind of a statement. He's made reference to a member who has contributed in the House, I mean, to the extent that he was heckling in the House. Mr. Speaker, members don't heckle. And I think Mr. Honorable Kioni should withdraw that remark of heckling. The member was contributing, and he made a constructive contribution, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw.
Mr. Speaker, I think yet another case of a person who didn't reason. I didn't say that Mheshimiwa Sankok in his contribution was heckling. If you just pay attention to what I'm saying and you see I have a point, eventually you'll be happy with what I want to say. Mr. Speaker, let me just...
Yes, very well, Honorable Kioni. Don't take that tangent. I'm sure you are moving away from that tangent.
Yes, I am. By saying this, Mr. Speaker, that when we have different views from what perhaps is popular on the floor, our colleagues should be careful not to heckle or to shout you down. Because just a few minutes ago, the nominated member, Sankok, opposed this motion, just like Sheikh had opposed earlier. But he wasn't heckled. That's the point I'm making. Mheshimiwa Munyinyi made very good reservations about the report. He was not heckled. What I'm unhappy about is the way we heckled that member. And he was very eloquent, making some very useful points. And Kenyans want to hear both sides of the divide. Parliament is about debating. It is not about whipping people emotionally to one side. I don't even need to bother to talk about this. In any case, I know what I wanted to say. Mheshimiwa Charles Kironzo will say it. We were with him in Mount Elgon during 10th Parliament. This is a very old issue. And if it is not giving a solution to the problem we identified then there is a problem. But I want to say this as I conclude. The Kenya Forest Management, whatever they are calling themselves, is Kenya, this is, what do you call this board? The board that manages the forest. It is not to deny us an opportunity to live in this world. It is to manage the environment so that we also benefit from the forest that is there. And I think they are missing a point. We said we need 10% cover of our forest in this country. But they cannot just sit there and not help us to build on the 10%. They tell us what we should do when we want to cut a piece of the forest so that people can be accommodated, they should also be able to account for what have they done to even conserve these endangered species, to ensure that the forest cover is being increased. When you drive from Nairobi, when you drive from Nairobi towards Nyeri, Mount Kenya region, you will see a lot of land now is covered by tree, and people are under that forest. Before it was clean shaven, but we can see people planting trees, so there is forest cover in areas that are settled, and this forest cover cannot only be in the forest. Mr. Speaker, I know you are not a stranger to Nyandarua. In any case, before you get to Laikipia, you go through Uhuru, the town you took away from us. And I want to tell you, to remind you this. Daragwa borders Aberdare Forest. We in Daragwa have taken care of the Aberdare Forest very well, for the reason that we have the Aberdare, the fence, the elephant fence that was done. We need to do similar fences elsewhere. But as I see it, we also want, as members of Daragwa constituency, to benefit from the Aberdare Forest. We cannot just take care of it and there are no benefits coming from us. And I believe that is part of the mandate of the Kenya Forest Service Board, not just to sit there and earn some sweet allowances. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We shall have Honorable Oyula Maelo.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for giving me this chance to contribute to this report. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by saying that I support this report. Mr. Speaker, although I would not encourage deforestation of our forests, but there are circumstances that contribute to such issues that are presented in this report. Mr. Speaker, we know very well that we have had a lot of fights between the two clans mentioned in this report in Mount Elgon Forest. Mr. Speaker, insecurity in Mount Elgon has been very high, and it is there because of land, the settlement of the squatters. These squatters have stayed in the forest without any title to the land. So it's only fair, Mr. Speaker, to listen to their cries and give them the opportunity to own land. It is because of this, they have already stayed in that land and have done a lot of deforestation. So whatever comes up, Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that they must be settled. And to settle them, the government is taking the right direction of requesting the Parliament or the National Assembly to give approval for the gazettement of this portion of land. This, Mr. Speaker, will help to solve a lot of quarrels that have existed in these areas. Mr. Speaker, we've had people fighting because of land in these areas.
Honorable Maelo, I'm afraid it is now 7 p.m. That is not to say that your time has lapsed. Just to say that when this motion or this item comes back to in the order paper, is scheduled in the order paper, you shall have 7 minutes to finish your submissions at that time, because now it is already 7.
Thank you.
Honorable members, the time being 7 p.m., this House stands adjourned till Tuesday, 15th of October 2019 at 2:30 p.m.